Chapter 32:16. The Nine Tribulations expert, whose expression did not change, said indifferently, "It is both a good and a bad thing for you to form your Tao fruit now. I hope you won't regret it in the future." As he spoke, his figure gradually dissipated. This time, he did not appear anywhere in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. At least, he did not appear anywhere that Luo Fan could sense. It seemed that he had directly left the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Seeing this, Luo Fan only needed to think for a moment to understand the Nine Tribulations expert's thoughts. To the Nine Tribulations expert, Luo Fan was now a hedgehog. A hedgehog that could hurt him if he touched it. Under the circumstances where there was no real enmity between them, no one would necessarily want to hurt such a hedgehog. But what real enmity did the Nine Tribulations expert have with Luo Fan? At most, it was Luo Fan who made the Nine Tribulations expert lose face. And this little disgrace was obviously not enough for him to risk triggering the power of the Tao Master's prison to make things difficult for him. In other words, this little conflict was not enough for him to be willing to endure the pain of the hedgehog's thorns in order to teach this hedgehog a lesson. Because of this, it was natural for the Nine Tribulations expert to leave. After all, he could not fight, and staying here would only make him uncomfortable. He would not be able to get the benefits that he originally could. In this case, what was the point of staying here? As for the last sentence he left, Luo Fan did not take it to heart. Indeed, forming the Tao fruit in advance was, in a sense, a good thing. It was enough for Luo Fan to experience what it was like to have a Tao fruit in advance, and to touch a certain characteristic of a true divine in advance. All of these would naturally be of great benefit to his growth. However, it was clear that there was a reason why Tao fruits only had a chance to condense at a higher cultivation level. For example, there was obviously a reason why an ordinary person would have a certain function at a certain age. Having a certain function in advance might have been a good thing at the time, as it would allow him to enjoy the various benefits brought about by that function. However, from the perspective of overall development, this kind of advance was obviously a kind of abnormal development. This kind of abnormal development would obviously have an impact on the person's final growth. Perhaps in the end, it would cause some kind of flaw to appear. For example, the function that it had in advance might be damaged because it was used too much. Of course, the Tao fruit of division was fundamentally different from the special abilities of ordinary people. Forming the Tao fruit in advance was a disadvantage for a cultivator, but it was impossible for it to be like some kind of function that would ultimately cause the function to be damaged because of having it in advance. But in general, they were quite similar. Although the people who were affected would not be so direct, there would definitely be some effect. Of course, these effects were naturally subtle and indescribable. Moreover, it was not something that Luo Fan could understand at this time. Luo Fan was very clear about this. In other words, he was quite clear about what the Nine Tribulations expert said. This was both a good and a bad thing. Under such circumstances, he naturally wouldn't care much about what the other party said. He already knew the truth clearly. Especially when he was quite clear about the intention of the Nine Tribulations expert when he said this. Why would the Nine Tribulations expert say such a thing? Of course, it couldn't be to remind Luo Fan. To this Nine Tribulations expert, Luo Fan was an existence that made him lose face. To an existence that made him lose face, no matter how magnanimous a person was, it was impossible for him to have no grudges in his heart. Moreover, he still said those words even though he had a grudge in his heart. His intentions were self-evident. Obviously, the intention of this Nine Tribulations expert saying such a thing could only be to make things difficult for Luo Fan. And after understanding that the other party was making things difficult for him, he naturally knew how to deal with this sentence. Ignoring it was the best way to deal with it, even if what the Nine Tribulations expert said was the truth. The disadvantages of obtaining the fruit of Tao in advance wouldn't disappear just because he ignored it. But, obviously, he ignored these possible disadvantages. At most, he just let things go back to how they were at the beginning. The disadvantages wouldn't be increased just because he ignored it, that's settled. Next, it's them. At this time, Luo Fan turned his eyes to the remaining 8 cultivators that he couldn't see through. Compared to the 9 tribulations expert, the 8 cultivators weren't as unfathomable as the 9 tribulations expert. But that was only relatively speaking. Their level of unfathomability had also reached a rather shocking level. At least, it was not something that a 6 tribulations expert or even a 7 tribulations expert could compare with. Although the 8 cultivators were grouped together, it was impossible for the 8 cultivators to be in the same group. There wasn't even a trace of connection between them. The circles they were in were all relatively independent, and it was even possible that not everyone among them knew of the existence of others. This seemed incredible, but if one thought about how many 6 tribulations experts there were on the 6th floor of the Tao Master's path, one would know how normal this situation was. The number of 6 tribulations experts on the 6th floor of the Tao Master's path was counted in the trillions. Although not all of the 6th tribulation powerhouses were gathered around Luo Fan's Tao fruit of separation, a large portion of them were still gathered here. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how many 6 tribulations experts were gathered around the fruit of Tao. And these 6 tribulations experts didn't gather around the same island branch, nor did they directly gather around the real fruit of Tao, which was the entire nothingness ocean. They were distributed among the countless layers of the nothingness ocean in a very special way. Although the distance between different layers of the nothingness ocean was nothing to the 6 tribulations experts, this separation had already divided the different layers of the nothingness ocean into natural circles. Under such circumstances, the cultivators in different layers of the nothingness ocean were naturally separated by a natural chasm. In this way, if the cultivators in different layers of the nothingness ocean did not know each other before, it would be extremely unlikely for them to find each other among the countless cultivators in the countless layers of the nothingness ocean. As for those 8 unfathomable cultivators, it was obviously impossible for them to know each other's existence in advance. Therefore, if they wanted to know each other's existence, they could only rely on luck unless they could be like Luo Fan and analyze their existence through the Tao Fruit Award. Obviously, their luck was not that good therefore, the 8 of them didn't know each other now. Perhaps in their hearts, they were the only cultivators of their level on the 6th floor of the Tao Master's path. Despite this mentality, they all showed great patience at this time. Although they all gathered around the island branch, or rather around the endless world, they did not really take any drastic action. Even though Luo Fan observed the countless possibilities of the future, the possibility that they would really take action in the next 100 million years was only an insignificant small part of it. It could even be said that a small part of it was overestimating. Seriously speaking, it was actually only a few dozen insignificant possibilities. From this, it could be seen how patient they were. One had to know that the possibility of the future encompassed almost all possible futures. Among them, there were really countless developments that went against logic. For example, the possibility of a cultivator who was extremely afraid of death suddenly committing suicide was only a small possibility among the countless possibilities. Even the probability of such a completely illogical possibility was not small. Among the countless possibilities, there were only a few dozen possibilities that the 8 experts would take action in the next 100 million years. This was enough to show how small the probability of them taking action was. And this small probability was clearly enough to show their true thoughts, enough to show how strong their patience was. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. From this, it could also be seen that the 8 cultivators obviously did not know about each other's existence. If they knew about each other's existence, they would know that they would have competitors. And once they knew that they had competitors, It was impossible for their patience to be as strong as it was now. After all, they might have enough patience, but they could not possibly think that others would have the same patience as them. It could be said that as long as they knew that there were other competitors, the chain of suspicion would naturally continue to extend. And once the chain of suspicion continued to extend, their patience would naturally be quickly worn down. Even if 100 million years was nothing to their concept of time, no matter how much their patience was worn down, it would not really be unable to withstand 100 million years. However, if it was in the endless possibilities, it would obviously be different. No matter what, with this chain of suspicion, their patience would definitely be affected. And if their patience was affected, the possibility of them taking action in the future would definitely be much more than now. Only this would lead to the current situation. Faced with such a change, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. They did not know each other, and for him, this was the best opportunity. An opportunity for him to easily defeat each of them. After all, these cultivators made him feel unfathomable, so their realm was at least higher than Luo Fan's current realm. And what was Luo Fan's realm now? His cultivation realm was the peak of the 7th tribulation realm. It was higher than his realm, so naturally, his realm had reached the level of the 8th tribulation realm. In other words, the 8 cultivators that Luo Fan felt unfathomable in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road were at least 8th tribulation realm. Coupled with the fact that they were not comparable to the previous 9th tribulation realm expert, Luo Fan could at least roughly infer that their realm should be at the level of the 8th tribulation realm. It went without saying how powerful an existence like the 8th tribulation realm expert was to them. Each of them was enough to bring great pressure to Luo Fan. Even though the Tao Master's prison was suppressing everything here, so that the 8th tribulation realm experts would not be too unscrupulous and unable to display their superb realm and strength. But for Luo Fan, they were also extremely dangerous. He even felt that they were even more dangerous than the 9th tribulation realm expert. Because the 9th tribulation realm expert had gone against 3 levels of the Tao Master's Road, he was like a creature that would die at the sight of light in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. But he could not display much of his strength at all, and did not even dare to reveal the traces of his existence too obviously. In contrast, although the strength of these 8th tribulation realm experts was far inferior to the 9th tribulation realm expert, they had only gone against 2 levels of the Tao Master's Road. Going against 2 levels of the Tao Master's Road was quite dangerous, but in the eyes of the Tao Master's prison, they were indeed existences in name. But after all, they would not die at the sight of light. The restrictions that the Tao Master's prison imposed on them could not be as strong as the restrictions that the 9th tribulation realm expert had encountered. And once the restrictions were not so strong, the strength that they could display would naturally be much stronger than that of the 9th tribulation realm expert. At least, compared to their overall strength, the strength that they could display was much stronger. And obviously, for Luo Fan, whose realm was lower than theirs, if he was not careful, no matter how much strength they displayed, he might not be able to resist and would be directly tortured to a horrible state. If it was only one 8th tribulation realm expert, although Luo Fan was worried, he would not pay much attention to it. After all, no matter how powerful the 8th tribulation realm expert was, no matter how terrifying the strength he displayed was, it was impossible for him to really be comparable to a 9th tribulation realm expert. Even if the 9th tribulation realm expert's performance was extremely restricted, however, it was obvious that it was not one 8th tribulation realm expert here, but 8 8th tribulation realm experts. The overall strength of these 8 8th tribulation realm experts might not be comparable to that of a 9th tribulation realm expert, but they were different individuals. They could cooperate with each other, conceal each other, and complement each other. Under such circumstances, the overall strength that they could display as a whole was at least tens of millions of times stronger than before. Chapter 32:18. Of course, it was precisely because of the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse's initial preparations that he was able to see a trace of something special about him. Therefore, although he had a deep understanding of the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse through the analysis of countless possibilities in the future, however, Luo Fan was still rather vague about the abilities and methods that the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse possessed. It was as if there was still a layer of fog that shrouded the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse, making it impossible for others to truly see through him. In the face of such a situation, although Luo Fan still felt a little regretful, he also knew that this was unavoidable. If an Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse's secrets could really be dug out so easily, then what value would there be for Luo Fan to spend so much effort on? If it was really that easy, as long as he created an environment and gave an opportunity, wouldn't he be able to dig out the secrets, principles, and mysteries that he wanted to dig out from the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse's body? After all, among the countless possibilities in the future, there was a possibility that he would do anything and use any method. And as long as it existed, it was inevitable for the countless possibilities to appear. In this way, as long as there were enough possibilities in the future, he would naturally be able to know more. Unfortunately, this was not the case. As an Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse, that cultivator clearly had some special characteristics that Luo Fan could not understand. Although this special characteristic was not enough to make him immune to the exploration of the fruit of Tao, it could still affect him to a certain extent. This kind of influence made it seem as if he was shrouded in fog during the exploration of the fruit of Tao. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan became even more interested in the various things that the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse was hiding. If he could really see through everything with a single glance, he would only need to use a few methods to obtain everything he wanted from the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse. In that case, what was the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse worth? With such a weak realm, how could he have the motivation to pursue it? Just like now, the other party had grasped some methods that he could not understand, and possessed some special traits that he could not imagine at all, causing his probing methods to lose the effect they should have. Although this seemed to be an obstacle in this matter, he did not achieve his desired goal, which was a bad thing. But looking at it as a whole, this was a direct display of the mysteriousness and power of the goal he was pursuing. This was obviously a good thing. Now that he knew the character of the Eighth Tribulation Powerhouse and the choices he might make in various situations, Luo Fan naturally knew what to do next. He immediately manipulated the futures that occupied many future possibilities and began to make all kinds of changes in the many future possibilities, guiding him to act according to his own will and exposing more of his secret. For Luo Fan, those were just possibilities in the future. Naturally, he could manipulate, change, and guide them at will. He didn't even need to care about the serious consequences of his actions. However, the situation was different for an Eighth Tribulation expert. For those Eighth Tribulation experts, the possibility was their reality. Everything they experienced in there was real, and it would lead to the real future. Because of this, they naturally paid close attention to all the changes that Luo Fan guided in those possibilities. Even if they knew that it might be a trap, or that there might be some mastermind behind it, they still couldn't bear to give up after seeing hope. In the end, they still seized those opportunities. For the Eighth Tribulation cultivators, sacrificing a bit of their own confidence would allow them to obtain the greatest results. They could even completely take the fruit away for themselves. No matter how one looked at it, it couldn't be more worth it. If the future really developed according to one of the possibilities, there was clearly no problem with this Eighth Tribulation expert's judgment. However, it was a pity that a possibility was only a possibility. Although it was a reality for all living beings in those possibilities, it was still a reality. But in the end, it was just an illusion or something like that. The large number of possibilities had already determined its nature. Although, in one possibility, the Eighth Tribulation expert only revealed a bit of confidence, this kind of showing occurred in countless possibilities. In this way, apart from the repeated showing of confidence, the addition of the non-repeated confidence was enough to form a general outline, allowing Luo Fan to have a relatively complete understanding of the Eighth Tribulation expert's methods. Moreover, this didn't take into account that Luo Fan didn't make targeted adjustments and targeted guidance among the many possibilities in the future. Obviously, how could Luo Fan not make targeted adjustments and targeted guidance? He wanted to stimulate the Eighth Tribulation expert and dig out all the secrets of the Eighth Tribulation expert through this kind of stimulation, so that the Eighth Tribulation expert's true state would be revealed in front of him. In this way, of course, he would constantly adjust the development of those possibilities in the future according to the Eighth Tribulation expert's response. Through this kind of adjustment, he would guide the Eighth Tribulation expert to reveal more methods. Although this kind of plan sounded very troublesome, in fact, for Luo Fan, in this kind of development, time was meaningless at all. No matter how many years had passed in those future possibilities, no matter how long the time in all the future possibilities was added up, for Luo Fan's reality, it was only less than a moment. Even in the future possibilities, Luo Fan had repeatedly stimulated the Eighth Tribulation expert countless times. Even if the overall time of stimulating the opponent had increased to the level of billions of years, for the real time, it was still only a moment. The Eighth Tribulation expert was hesitating whether to seize the flaw that he deliberately revealed to step into the branch of the island, or ignore this flaw and look for a more real flaw. In this way, time was of course meaningless to him. He could almost squander it at will. Of course, although he could squander this time at will in theory, Luo Fan naturally couldn't really squander any time. With those countless possibilities, he could naturally relax a little in some possibilities, calm his mind and settle down again. However, it was obvious that if he really completely thought that time was meaningless and completely squandered it at will, it would obviously be a slow suicide. Wasting time to wear down one's willpower was secondary. More importantly, for Luo Fan, the eighth great calamity was still hanging over his head. And this tribulation obviously didn't care about the real time, it only cared about the time that Luo Fan had experienced. The fact that the time in the future possibilities could not be recognized as real time was actually already the reason why the fruit of division of Tao could create loopholes that originally didn't exist out of thin air. Under such circumstances, squandering and wasting time was obviously wasting the loopholes created by the fruit of division of Tao. And wasting this loophole would naturally cause one to suffer the backlash of this loophole. In the end, the power of the tribulation would definitely be increased due to the appearance of this loophole. The loophole created by the fruit of division of Tao was wasted, but not only did the backlash from the loophole not disappear, it became even stronger. As such, the outcome was self-evident. It could be said that wasting this time, squandering this time, was simply wasting his life, squandering his life. Of course, for Luo Fan, he did not actually consider all of this clearly. Right now, he only instinctively felt that squandering and wasting time would bring about relatively bad consequences, but he still did not know what the consequences were. However, as long as he had this feeling, it was actually enough for existences at Luo Fan's level. After all, at their level, the accuracy of their feelings had far surpassed their rational judgment. As long as a cultivator could survive to this level, they would definitely have experienced this countless times. Luo Fan was no exception. Therefore, just having this feeling was enough to completely dispel the distracting thoughts of wasting time. Of course, although he could not waste time, it did not mean that he had to make the best use of all his time to cultivate and improve himself. Relaxing and settling down was also a type of cultivation. Although it was more time-consuming, it was actually indispensable. Using time on this naturally could not be considered a waste, nor could it be considered squandering. It's a pity that even so, I can only obtain some superficial information. The true core is still shrouded in fog. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Even though he had used the fruit of division of Tao to occupy and control the possibility of the future to achieve this step, and analyzed the eighth tribulation powerhouse to the bone, the final conclusion he obtained was only touching on the surface of the eighth tribulation powerhouse. As for the true core characteristics of the eighth tribulation powerhouse, he still did not have much understanding. On the contrary, he felt that the fog above the core characteristics seemed to have become denser and more difficult to see through. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was both emotional and regretful. He naturally sighed with emotion at the unfathomable power of an eighth tribulation expert, but he also regretted that it was unfathomable. The reason why he felt that it was unfathomable was because the eighth tribulation expert was one of the steps towards his ultimate goal. The more unfathomable this realm was, it meant that when he finally stepped into this realm, he would also be equally unfathomable, or even more unfathomable. It was a pity that he was so unfathomable that he couldn't perfectly achieve his goal at this moment. Although he could not perfectly achieve his goal, to a certain extent, Luo Fan had already completed his goal this time. Although he had spent more time and energy on exploring the secrets of the eighth tribulation powerhouse among the countless future possibilities. But in fact, this was not the most direct reason why Luo Fan wanted to lure the eighth tribulation powerhouse into the endless world, or rather, into the fruit of division of Tao. But in fact, this was not the most direct reason why Luo Fan wanted to lure the eighth tribulation powerhouse into the endless world, or rather, into the fruit of division of Tao. His most direct purpose was to let the eighth tribulation powerhouse know that there was a competitor that he could not cooperate with. Obviously, in order to achieve this, Luo Fan's current understanding of the eighth tribulation powerhouse was actually already enough. After all, if he wanted to lead two cultivators into an irreconcilable conflict, he actually did not need to thoroughly understand all the secrets of the two cultivators. He only needed to know the two cultivators' personalities, which was actually already a very high success rate. If he had a deeper understanding of the two cultivators, for example, knowing their interests and so on, the success rate would be higher. And obviously, Luo Fan's current understanding of the eighth tribulation powerhouse had already far exceeded this requirement. His current understanding of the eighth tribulation powerhouse was only lacking the core characteristics of the eighth tribulation powerhouse. As for other things, such as personality, behavior, and even the interests that they were most concerned about, etc., he was extremely clear about them. And these were obviously enough for him to carry out a plan. Of course, this did not mean that he could start planning now. If he wanted to create a conflict and prevent the two sides from truly cooperating, he naturally had to have an extremely deep understanding of both sides to be able to do it. It was simply impossible to achieve this goal by simply having some understanding of one side and being completely unfamiliar with the other side. Therefore, at this time, for Luo Fan, the real action he should take was obviously not to start the final step of creating a conflict, but to first do what he did to this eighth tribulation powerhouse, and then repeat it to another eighth tribulation powerhouse, or even more eighth tribulation powerhouses. Through these repetitions, he would be able to truly grasp the mentality of other eighth tribulation powerhouses, and then grasp what the other eighth tribulation powerhouses were thinking at this time and what kind of reactions they would have after certain experiences. Only in this way could he truly grasp the point of their conflict, and to the greatest extent possible to prevent them from cooperating. Fortunately, with the fruit of division, Luo Fan could occupy countless future possibilities. Otherwise, just this step alone would probably be too much for him to bear. Don't forget, his eighth tribulation would descend after a fixed amount of time. If he didn't have the fruit of division, just this step alone might have wasted who knows how many hundreds of millions of years. And if he really wasted who knows how many hundreds of millions of years on this, then not to mention the eighth tribulation, the ninth tribulation might even descend, Chapter 32:19. Although the method of testing was similar, the process of testing the other 7 eighth tribulation powerhouses was naturally not the same as the process of testing the first 8th tribulation powerhouse. After all, the personalities and cultivation paths of those 8th tribulation experts were all different. The reactions they would make in the same situation would naturally be different as well. In this way, even if the beginning of the entire testing process was the same, the final development would naturally be completely different. For example, when the 4th 8th tribulation expert, Luo Fan, found a faintly discernible flaw, he didn't hesitate, but directly attacked, brazenly using his own physical strength and great power to directly attack the island branch. Although his attack didn't really destroy the branch of the island, nor was it able to shake the fruit of division, his attitude clearly displayed his personality to the fullest. After attacking the branch of the island, the 8th tribulation expert turned around and left. He no longer had any thoughts of staying around the branch of the island. Such a decisive abandonment was obviously extremely inconsistent with his identity. As an 8th tribulation expert, normally speaking, he should be indomitable. Not to mention that it was just a sign that he was being schemed against, even if the scheme was about to happen, or even if failure had already befallen him. He should still continue to pull himself together and continue to struggle, not to mention that it was just a sign that he was being schemed against. Just like now, he actually gave up on a huge project that should have lasted for more than 100 million years after discovering a hint. How was this the style of a normal 8th tribulation expert? However, Luo Fan wasn't surprised by his choice. At the very least, he wasn't surprised when he gave up at this moment. After all, although it seemed that the 8th tribulation expert had directly given up on the original plan, in reality, he didn't make the same decision for every possibility in the endless future. Even if, given his personality, there was a high chance that he would make such a decision, it was still a high chance after all. He wouldn't make such a decision with 100% certainty. As long as it wasn't 100%, then, among the countless possibilities in the future, there would definitely be some possibilities in which he would make a different decision. And the number would definitely not be small. In other words, through observing the countless possibilities in the future, Luo Fan had already seen the countless decisions that the 8th tribulation expert made when he encountered countless opportunities. Through these decisions, he already had a fairly deep understanding of his personality. After having such a deep understanding of her decision, he naturally understood the greatest possibility of her making a decision when faced with the flaws that he revealed, which could very well be a trap. That was why he wasn't surprised that the 8th tribulation expert had made such a decision. What a pity I lost a bargaining chip. However, even though he wasn't surprised, he still couldn't help but feel pity. An 8th tribulation expert was a bargaining chip for him now. A bargaining chip that could implicate other 8th tribulation experts. Now that the 8th tribulation expert had turned around and left, wouldn't Luo Fan lose a bargaining chip? The behavior of this 8th tribulation expert instantly attracted the attention of the other 8th tribulation expert. Although they were separated by countless layers of nothingness, theoretically speaking, they shouldn't be able to sense each other. However, don't forget what this 8th tribulation powerhouse had done previously. Before that, he had directly attacked the branch of the island. Although this kind of attack was not enough to really shake the branch of the island or the fruit of the way, it was obviously not at the level of a 6th tribulation expert. Even if this 8th tribulation expert himself had restrained his realm and strength, when he found that the owner of the branch of the island had not only discovered him, but had also begun to plot against him, he naturally couldn't hide himself like he did before when he still had the opportunity to explore the fruit of the way. At that time, even if he continued to restrain his realm and strength because of inertia, it was impossible for him to be as perfect as before. Once he was not perfect, the final result would be that the strength he exerted would be far beyond the level of a sixth tribulation expert. Even if he didn't reach the level of an eighth tribulation expert, it wouldn't be a problem for him to reach the level of a seventh tribulation expert. In this sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, the power of a seventh tribulation expert was as conspicuous as a torch being lit in the boundless darkness. Therefore, it naturally attracted the attention of the eighth tribulation experts, who were already quite vigilant. Even if they might be separated from each other by countless layers of the nothingness ocean, they couldn't hide this kind of attention. However, although they noticed the existence of the eighth tribulation expert, the other eighth tribulation experts didn't take any action. They just watched the eighth tribulation expert leave. Although there was a great possibility of cooperation between them, it didn't mean that they really opened their hearts to every eighth tribulation expert. Once they met, they immediately stuck together and began to work together. This was obviously impossible. In this sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, there were only 8 eighth tribulation experts, which seemed to be a small number. They should be very close to each other. However, don't forget that this was only the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road. In the eighth level of the Tao Master's Road, the number of eighth tribulation experts was counted in the hundreds of millions. The meeting of any 2 eighth tribulation experts was equivalent to the meeting of 2 completely unfamiliar ordinary creatures in a vast and boundless world. Obviously, anyone would inevitably be a little vigilant when meeting a stranger, unless it was a weirdo. If the stranger wanted to leave, it was inevitable that they would see him off. It was better to avoid trouble than to stop the stranger and cooperate with him to complete some task. At this time, these eighth tribulation experts were no exception. Although they also knew that if they cooperated with each other, they could have quite amazing strength, which was enough to greatly increase their chances of completing the task. However, at this time, seeing a strange eighth tribulation expert, they still became more vigilant, so they didn't stop the eighth tribulation expert. In the end, they could only watch the eighth tribulation expert disappear from their perception. As for where he went, other than Luo Fan, who had a slight feeling, the other 8 tribulation experts had no idea. After all, the eighth tribulation expert was in the same realm as them. If he didn't want to be sensed by them, it would be difficult for them to sense him. It was just like if they didn't want to be sensed by the eighth tribulation expert, it would be difficult for the eighth tribulation expert to sense them. As for why Luo Fan could faintly sense where he went, the reason was very simple. It was because he had a deep understanding of the eighth tribulation expert's character through the in-depth study of the countless future possibilities. Through this deep understanding, he could roughly infer what kind of decision he would make under what circumstances, what direction he would choose when he left, and what environment he would choose. Through this kind of deduction, he could naturally roughly guess where he went at this time. In other words, this kind of perception was actually more because of logical reasoning and preconceived notions. It was like in a page of text. If one knew in advance that there might be a certain word in a certain position, he would naturally be able to see that word at a glance. However, if one didn't know the general position of the word and only knew that it was on this page, it would obviously not be so easy to find it. At the very least, one would need to search from beginning to end to be able to find it. The eighth tribulation expert did not leave the 6th floor of the Tao Master's Road. At this moment, he was still in the 6th floor of the Tao Master's Road. However, of course, he was already far away from the branch of the island, or rather, the fruit of separation. After watching the eighth tribulation expert leave, the remaining 7 eighth tribulation experts were inexplicably vigilant. At this moment, they already had some guesses about the possibility that there were other eighth tribulation experts around the fruit of split ways. After all, if there was one, there would naturally be more. If they could come here, then other eighth tribulation experts could naturally come here too. Moreover, it should be easy to see this from the analysis of probability alone. There were hundreds of millions of Eighth Tribulation experts on the 8th floor of the Tao Masters Road. With such a huge number, even if an Eighth Tribulation expert went against the Tao Masters Road, the probability of returning to the 6th floor of the Tao Masters Road was extremely small. There would inevitably be a considerable number of them coming to the 6th floor. The fruit of separation was so conspicuous on the 6th floor of the Tao Masters Road. It could almost be regarded as the main character of the 6th floor of the Tao Masters Road during this period of time. If those 8th Tribulation experts came to this floor, how could they not notice it? If they noticed it, how could they not want to explore it? With this reasoning, it was almost certain that there would be other 8th Tribulation powerhouses around the islands in the various layers of the Void Ocean layer. And there might be a lot of them. Guessing this, the 8th Tribulation experts felt an inexplicable sense of urgency in their heart. For Luo Fan, he was worried that these 8th Tribulation experts would cooperate with each other after discovering each other. Even if he had the fruit of separation, it would be difficult for him to withstand the power of the fruit of separation. But in fact, for those 8th Tribulation experts, after confirming the existence of each other, the first thought that came to their minds was definitely not the existence of a companion who could cooperate with them. The first thought that came to their minds was definitely vigilance. They had to be on guard. What will they do when they find me? This guess would inevitably appear in their minds. And the result of this guess would definitely not be positive. Speculating about other people's evil intentions was something that any sensible person who was responsible for themselves would do. After all, guessing others in a malicious direction was at most a groundless fear, worrying about something that shouldn't be worried about. But on the contrary, guessing others in a benign direction would result in a different result. If it was right, then naturally nothing would happen. But what if it was wrong? If it was wrong, then because they weren't on guard against others, once the other party attacked, the damage would probably be 10 times or even 100 times greater than normal. Compared to the gains, the risk was obviously much greater. It could be said that it was not proportional at all. On the other hand, the risk of guessing others to be malicious was much more balanced when compared to the rewards. At most, it would just be a waste of effort. But if the guess was right, then it could save one's life under the other party's hostility. At least it was for one's own benefit. In this way, after discovering that there were other 8th Tribulation powerhouses around the Fruit of Ways, it was very obvious what their first decision would be. They would try their best to hide themselves. The traces that were left behind were now completely eliminated by them, of course. At the same time, they also tried their best to sense the layers of nothingness around the Fruit of Ways. They sensed all the cultivators within, wanting to find the existence of other 8th Tribulation powerhouses. This was obviously a normal state of mind. For themselves, they hoped that others who had good or bad intentions wouldn't be able to discover them. But for those who had good or bad intentions, they hoped that they could grasp all of their movements and even all of their traces. This was a contradiction, but it was the essential difference between how living beings treated others and themselves. Under such circumstances, those 8th Tribulation powerhouses could naturally feel an indescribable sense of vigilance from the bottom of their hearts. Even ordinary living beings would sometimes feel some sense when others were searching for them, let alone these 8th Tribulation powerhouses. When they searched each other, it would naturally make them feel like they were being searched by others. Under such circumstances, they would naturally be more vigilant. They would naturally restrain themselves even more, and their search for others would also become more intense. Their decision made them even more vigilant. It made them restrain themselves even more, and their search for others would become even more intense. Like this, layer by layer, it almost formed a vicious cycle. Those 8th Tribulation powerhouses were naturally well aware of the possible consequences of their decision. However, they clearly didn't change their minds. After all, this concerned their lives, and at least their interests. Even if this decision would make the situation more and more tense, they didn't care. Chapter 32:20. From a certain point of view, the departure of the eighth tribulation expert had already completed Luo Fan's plan. After all, the fundamental purpose of Luo Fan's many plans was to let the eighth tribulation experts know of each other's existence, and to be extremely vigilant of each other's existence. And the current situation was that although his various plans had not been completed, the eighth tribulation experts were clearly in a state of mutual vigilance. Didn't this satisfy his request? However, in the face of such a situation, Luo Fan did not feel relieved. Although their current state was already in the state that he wanted, it was obviously only temporary. With the rationality of these eighth tribulation experts, how could they not distinguish what kind of vigilance was necessary, and what kind of vigilance was unnecessary? For example, the current state of being extremely vigilant towards each other just because they knew of each other's existence was obviously unnecessary. The reason why they were so vigilant at this time was because they were extremely unfamiliar with each other and did not understand each other. However, with the methods and wisdom of these eighth tribulation experts, as long as time passed, they would naturally think of various ways to confirm each other's character, mentality, and other things. In this way, as long as time passed, they would naturally be able to regain their calmness, and they would naturally let go of this unnecessary vigilance. At that time, the cooperation between them would be a matter of course. From this, it could be seen that if Luo Fan did not take any action, and did not continue with the plan that he had previously prepared, these eighth tribulation experts would at most maintain this state of vigilance for the time being. Moreover, this current vigilance might instead become an opportunity for them to cooperate with each other, and break through the obstacles of their cooperation. It was precisely because he understood this that Luo Fan did not let go of his vigilance, nor did he have the thought of stopping his plan. Instead, he continued with his various preparations. Although the departure of the eighth tribulation expert seemed to have disrupted his entire plan, Luo Fan was still prepared to carry out his original plan, which was to test the remaining eighth tribulation experts. Don't forget that the eighth tribulation expert who left previously was not the eighth person he tested. After that eighth tribulation expert, there were still a few people waiting for him to test, analyze, and dissect. At this moment, he directly manipulated the Tao fruit of division and revealed a few faintly discernible flaws in front of the remaining eighth tribulation experts. Through these flaws, he could probe the possible choices those eighth tribulation experts might make. Then, through the different choices he made and the countless future possibilities, he dissected his personality, his strength, his path of cultivation, and many other things. With the help of the analysis, he found a way to create irreconcilable conflicts with the other eighth tribulation expert. With the assistance of the splitting Tao fruit, it only took a few breaths of time for him to finish all of this. However, such a short amount of time was not enough for the eighth tribulation experts to calm down and begin to determine the degree of danger each other posed, as well as the possibility and necessity of cooperation. Therefore, when Luo Fan finished testing all the eighth tribulation experts, they were still in a rather vigilant state. They still didn't trust each other. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was naturally very satisfied. And after confirming each other's personalities, he began to understand what to do next. Immediately, he had a thought. Two eighth tribulation experts suddenly felt a subtle suction coming from the branch of the island that they had been studying for a long time. This suction was so strong that even though they were eighth tribulation experts, they couldn't resist it for a moment. In a flash, they were sucked into the branch of the island. This suction was so fast that even the sixth tribulation experts around them didn't notice it at all. At most, some sixth tribulation experts with sharp senses suddenly felt that something seemed to be slightly different around them. Apart from that, for example, confirming that a sixth tribulation expert had suddenly disappeared or that the branch of the island had suddenly undergone some kind of change, there was nothing. The reason for this was naturally because the suction was too fast, and the way it was used was too subtle. The level of its manifestation was far beyond the scope of what sixth tribulation experts could understand. As for why there was such a manifestation that was far beyond the scope of the understanding of the strong, the reason was even simpler. It was because Luo Fan's previous attack wasn't just relying on the island's branches as it seemed. Instead, he directly used the supreme power of the fruit of division of the way to attack those eighth tribulation experts. The fruit of division of the way was something that even ninth tribulation experts desired to gain from. It was an existence that could give Luo Fan some characteristics that belonged to true divine. It was imaginable how high the essence of such an existence was. If it could really be used to its full potential, even ninth tribulation experts would probably have a hard time, let alone these eighth tribulation experts. Therefore, these eighth tribulation experts were so easily absorbed into the branch of the island by the power of the fruit of division of the way. In other words, they were absorbed into the endless world and the fruit of division of the way. As for the other sixth tribulation experts, even if all of this happened right in front of them, they wouldn't be able to sense it at all, not to mention these sixth tribulation experts. Even the other eighth tribulation experts that hadn't been absorbed into the branch of the fruit of division of the way still didn't sense the change at all. They were still on guard against each other. Luo Fan didn't completely relax at this moment. Instead, he carefully observed the eighth tribulation expert. Through his observation of the possibilities of the future, he completely confirmed that they didn't notice that he had already started to deal with the two eighth tribulation experts. Only then did he truly relax. At this moment, he could start to plot against the eighth tribulation experts in the fruit of division of the way. As for the method of plotting, it was mainly to enter the fruit of division of the way. For him, it was obviously an extremely simple matter. In the outside world, although the fruit of division of the way could extend a little of its power, it was only a tiny bit of power that was insignificant. Even if it seemed very powerful and could even pose a threat to an eighth tribulation expert, it was actually quite easy to avoid it. At the very least, with the means of an eighth tribulation expert, if they really knew that the fruit of division of the way had power that could be extended, they could make this power miss in minutes. However, the situation was different in the fruit of division of the way. Within the fruit of division of the way, all of the power of the fruit of division of the way could be perfectly unleashed. To Luo Fan, who had grasped the fruit of division of the way, the past, the present, and the future were all existences that he could change at will with a single thought. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to plot against two cultivators and cause irreconcilable conflict between the two cultivators, it was really as simple as speaking. Even if the two cultivators were eighth tribulation experts, existences whose realms were much higher than Luo Fan's, they were no exception. As for the specific process of plotting, there was actually nothing much to say. It was nothing more than creating coincidences, using gratitude and hatred to guide them, and using benefits to entice them. Even if the eighth tribulation experts were extremely powerful, had extremely high realms, and had earth-shattering power, how could they resist when their past, present, and future were all completely controlled by someone else and could be changed and manipulated at will? Therefore, it didn't take long for the two of them to become irreconcilable enemies. When the conflict and hatred between the two eighth tribulation experts reached this point, Luo Fan naturally didn't let them out. He wanted to create conflict for them so that he could defeat the 7 eighth tribulation experts one by one. Under such circumstances, it went without saying which situation was more advantageous for him, being inside the fruit of division of the way or being outside the fruit of division of the way. Therefore, even though he had achieved his goal, he didn't let them out. Instead, he only slightly relaxed his control and influence over them. After that, he repeated the previous process and directly sucked the other 2 eighth tribulation experts into the fruit of division of the way to carry out the previous plan. Of course, although the general process was similar, the specific method was, of course, completely different. Different Eighth Tribulation experts had different personalities. For those with such personalities, they would definitely not accept certain actions from others. Once they did it, they would not be able to live under the same sky as them. However, for those with another personality, such actions might instead make them feel close to each other and deepen their friendship. If it wasn't because of this, why did Luo Fan need to first test these Eighth Tribulation experts and determine their personalities before plotting against them? Because of this test, he ended up alerting the enemy, causing one of the Eighth Tribulation experts to turn around and leave, revealing the traces of an Eighth Tribulation expert. If he didn't need to consider personalities and only needed to create a specific situation to make people irreconcilable enemies with each other, why would he need to go through so much trouble? Obviously, the second batch of Eighth Tribulation experts and the first batch of Eighth Tribulation experts had different personalities. If he wanted to make the conflict between them irreconcilable, he naturally needed to stimulate them in different ways. But for Luo Fan, this was just a trivial matter. After all, through the previous test, he had a very clear understanding of the personalities of these Eighth Tribulation experts. Naturally, he knew how to stimulate them to achieve the best effect. As for the way to stimulate them, it was needless to say. He could adjust the past, the present, and the future at will and create coincidences. For him, it was really just a matter of thinking. Even if he couldn't directly change the past of these Eighth Tribulation experts, for him, it was just a little troublesome, but not a real obstacle. As for why he couldn't directly change the past of these Eighth Tribulation experts, it was needless to say. These Eighth Tribulation experts were obviously existences like incarnations, doppelgangers, or projections, but their real bodies were still outside the fruit of division of the way, or even outside the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. Under such circumstances, changing their past was obviously only the past of the incarnations. Their real bodies were still unchanged. In this way, once the past of the incarnations, doppelgangers or projections was changed, then their real bodies would naturally sense it, and they would really have the memory before and after the past was changed. Obviously, once they knew this, everything that Luo Fan had done would obviously be no secret. At that time, how much hatred and injustice they had, how much anger and hatred they would have for Luo Fan. Therefore, it was of course impossible to directly change their past. But of course, this was certainly not a problem for Luo Fan. For him, it was not impossible to directly change their past, but for him, it was not impossible to achieve his own goal. Even if he couldn't change their past, he could change the past of other creatures, and even the past of heaven and earth. As long as this change had already happened before they sensed it, then they naturally wouldn't feel anything. Naturally, he could directly achieve his goal, creating the situation that Luo Fan wanted, making the contradiction between them deeper and deeper, and finally become irreconcilable, or even irreconcilable. However, of course there were risks. After all, because of the magic of the fruit of division of the way, these Eighth Tribulation experts knew that there was a way to change the past here, so they spent time waiting around and began to study the island branches, the endless world, and the fruit of division. If things were really too coincidental, too obvious, they would naturally be able to sense that the past had been changed, and that the owner of the fruit of division of the way had used some means to change the past to create all of this. Therefore, although it was easy to say, it was actually quite troublesome to do. But for Luo Fan, this was naturally not a problem. As long as he knew what their scruples were, and what their characters were like, he could obviously bypass these troubles easily. After all, to him, he already had an extremely deep understanding of the personalities of these Eighth Tribulation experts. Naturally, he knew which actions they had done when they clearly knew that someone was plotting behind their backs, and if someone else did it, it would be absolutely unforgivable and absolutely irreconcilable. For example, Even if a person knew that someone else had killed their entire family because of someone else's scheme, and that it was an accidental killing, could they really forgive the person who killed their entire family? This was clearly impossible. No matter who was plotting, who was guiding, and who was the root cause of this matter, the fact that they had killed their entire family could not be changed. As long as they did this, then no matter who the root cause was, they would definitely kill that person for revenge. At most, they would just have one more target to hate. Chapter 32:21. This was the case for most people, and there was no exception for the Eighth Tribulation powerhouses. Even if some traces would be revealed, even if the other party would discover that someone was plotting against them due to Luo Fan's various actions. However, as long as the plan was good, even if they knew that it was a scheme, the conflict between them wouldn't be completely eliminated. Of course, at the same time, if they knew that someone was plotting against them, their displeasure and hatred towards this person would naturally be stronger than towards each other. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan didn't care what they thought of him now. From the moment they became interested in his fruit of division, there was already an irreconcilable conflict between them and Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, even if they had a good impression of him, it wouldn't make them give up on their various schemes for the fruit of division. Similarly, even if they were filled with malice towards Luo Fan, the situation wouldn't be any worse for Luo Fan. In this way, he naturally didn't need to care about their attitude towards him. Of course, all of this was only if they could see the traces of manipulation. According to Luo Fan's current plans and calculations, the possibility of them seeing these traces was actually not too high. If they couldn't see these traces, then he naturally wouldn't need to worry about all of this. In order to complete the destruction of the relationship between the Eighth Tribulation powerhouses, Luo Fan had adjusted the past, present, and future of the endless world almost tens of millions of times. It could be said that all of their experiences and encounters in the fruit of division could be said to have been painstakingly arranged by Luo Fan. Due to this arrangement, even if the Eighth Tribulation powerhouses were originally completely strangers to each other, when they truly got to know each other, they would become absolutely irreconcilable enemies. It's finally done. When the last Eighth Tribulation powerhouse was properly arranged, Luo Fan finally let out a long sigh of relief. At this moment, the 7 Eighth Tribulation powerhouses were already in the endless world. They were in different places in the endless world, different layers of the void ocean, and different branches of the island. Because of the various contradictions that Luo Fan had caused, at this moment, all of their attention was focused on each other. All kinds of schemes were to make each other suffer losses. All these schemes were to make things difficult for the others. Their arrival had a huge impact on the endless world. It was self-evident. In this endless world, the strongest people were originally only Sixth Tribulation powerhouses. Although their numbers were beyond imagination, they were still only at the level of a Sixth Tribulation expert. Under such circumstances, the arrival of this Eighth Tribulation powerhouse was like a giant stepping into a country of miniature people. It could be said that just their existence itself was enough to shock everyone in this world, making them realize how tiny they were. Not to mention, these Eighth Tribulation experts weren't just staying obediently in this endless world. Because of Luo Fan's schemes, they were constantly fighting each other. They were plotting against each other. In this kind of plotting, their power, which was 2 realms higher than a Sixth Tribulation powerhouse, was displayed to the fullest. Their ability to easily reverse karma, reverse time, and crush Sixth Tribulation powerhouses like ants allowed everyone in this endless world to clearly understand just how great the gap was between them and themselves. They also completely understood just how great the gap was between them and themselves. Under such circumstances, the atmosphere in this endless world naturally underwent a subtle change. Vaguely, the collective consciousness of the many transcendent transcendents that controlled the boundless world seemed to be gradually losing its original absolute control. Vaguely, they showed signs of submitting to the eighth tribulation expert. If it wasn't for the fact that the conflicts between the eighth tribulation powerhouses couldn't be resolved, causing them to clash and interfere with each other on many levels, this trend wouldn't just be a trend, but a reality. However, even so, it also caused the structure of authority in this endless world to undergo a subtle change. The authority structure that was originally inclined towards the transcendent beings could no longer be found. And this change caused the development of this endless world to become more and more natural, or rather, more and more random. Although I can't find any traces, this development is still too much of a coincidence. All of this should be created by you, right? An eighth tribulation powerhouse sighed at a certain moment. Although he couldn't find any traces of interference from any abnormal forces, he still felt that their various encounters after entering this endless world were the result of some existence manipulating behind the scenes. It was actually not difficult to guess this point. There were hundreds of millions of eighth tribulation powerhouses on the eighth level of the Tao Master's path. Naturally, there would inevitably be those who had completely incompatible personalities, who would inevitably dislike each other when they met, and the longer they spent together, the deeper the conflict between them would be. However, the probability of all the eight tribulations experts appearing on the sixth level of the road to Tao Master being like this was too small. In particular, the 7 eighth tribulation powerhouses were all in the same state, and they all had such conflicting personalities, so the probability was obviously even smaller. Therefore, just from this result alone, it could be known that there must be some external force influencing all their encounters after entering this endless world. Even if they couldn't find any traces at all, everything seemed to develop extremely naturally, and it was all the result of their respective personalities. With this speculation, it went without saying how much the eighth tribulation powerhouse was unhappy with the existence behind the fruit of the way. It could be said that as much as he disliked the other eighth tribulation powerhouses, he disliked the existence behind the fruit of the way. If there was a chance to put the two in front of him and let him choose to attack them, he would probably have to carefully consider which one to attack. However, apart from being so unhappy and disliked the existence behind the fruit of the way, he was even more concerned about the fruit of the way, and his desire for the mysteries within it grew even stronger. After all, he was an eighth tribulation powerhouse. Even if he was nothing in the eighth level of the Tao Master's path, and was only one of the countless cultivators of the same level, he was supreme in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Even if it was the existence behind the Tao fruit splitting, it was still countless times weaker than them. However, it was precisely because of this difference in strength that the existence behind the fruit of the way was able to easily toy with them in the palm of his hand. Even though they now knew from other evidence that the existence had acted, they still couldn't find any traces of it. In fact, the more they analyzed it, the more they felt that all of this was actually a very natural development. All of this was actually the result of their personalities. This situation was enough to show how powerful and incredible the fruit of the way was. In fact, every eighth tribulation powerhouse had similar thoughts. It was precisely because of these thoughts that they were still able to stay in this boundless world and endure the wanton influence of the existence behind the Tao fruit. This kind of mentality was actually very normal. It was just like how the ninth tribulation powerhouse had stayed in the fruit of the way even though he knew that Luo Fan was analyzing and testing him. It could be said that if it wasn't for the mysteries of the fruit of the way being beyond his imagination, making the analysis and testing a little unbearable, he might still be in the fruit of the way. Even the ninth tribulation powerhouse was like this, so the eighth tribulation powerhouses naturally went one step further. The ninth tribulation powerhouse might even change his mind and leave the fruit of the way because the analysis and testing ability of the fruit of the way was unbearable, but the eighth tribulation powerhouses would rather endure all of this and stubbornly stay in the fruit of the way, striving to obtain the mysteries that they wanted to obtain. As for why, there was no need to explain. For the ninth tribulation powerhouses, although the fruit of the way was rare, it wasn't necessary for them to obtain it. But for the eighth tribulation powerhouses, it was different. The eighth tribulation powerhouses might have heard of the existence of the fruit of the way, but those who could actually see the fruit of the way were definitely extremely rare. Under such circumstances, once they missed the fruit of the way, it could be said that they had missed the fruit of the way forever. As a result, their tolerance towards Luo Fan's schemes was naturally much stronger than that of the ninth tribulation powerhouses. Therefore, even though they were so unhappy with Luo Fan that it had even reached the point of hatred, they still braced themselves to stay in this endless world and didn't choose to leave. Even if they wanted to leave, they would still need to put in quite a bit of effort in the beginning. Luo Fan didn't fully understand their mentality. However, as time passed and he continued to probe them, he completely understood their mentality. And after understanding their mentality, his actions became even more fearless. All kinds of methods that he didn't dare to use because he was afraid of exposing himself could now be used without any scruples. After all, the other party already knew of his existence and the existence of his various schemes. If he still insisted on pretending that he didn't exist, what was the difference between deceiving himself and others? As he changed like this, his understanding of the eighth tribulation powerhouses continued to deepen. Moreover, compared to what the eighth tribulation powerhouses had imagined, the speed of deepening was more than 10 million times faster. Don't forget that in the fruit of the way, Luo Fan could manipulate the past, present, and future at will. For someone like him, all he needed was a primer, and he would be able to foresee the countless possible outcomes that could develop. And through these countless outcomes, the different reactions, different actions, and different schemes of the eighth tribulation powerhouses, he was naturally able to greatly deepen his understanding of the eighth tribulation powerhouses. Whether it was in terms of strength, methods, or other things, it was the same. And his behavior also made the eighth tribulation powerhouses a little confused. They even faintly felt that the existence behind the fruit of the way seemed to be a little indecisive. After all, every time he started a certain kind of test, it didn't mean that he would actually carry it out. He would immediately change his mind and change to another kind of test, another kind of scheme, and another kind of test. But of course, this kind of thinking couldn't last for too long. After all, they weren't completely clueless about the fruit of the way. They weren't completely unaware of what the sixth tribulation powerhouses had sensed before. Therefore, very soon, they knew what was going on and understood what kind of incredible things were happening outside the range of their senses. The past, present, and future were all under the control of the other party. In other words, in the eyes of the other party, the future development must be vivid, without the slightest omission. In this way, the reason for his previous behavior couldn't be any clearer. To the other party, there was clearly no need for him to actually take action at all. He only needed a beginning, a primer, and he could already see everything they would do in the future, as well as all the consequences. Thinking of this, all of them began to feel extremely pressured. A feeling that everything about them was no longer a secret in the other party's eyes involuntarily arose. Fruit of the way. Fruit of the way. These eighth tribulation powerhouses couldn't help but let out similar sighs. At the same time, their desire for the fruit of the way became even more intense. No wonder he wanted us to become irreconcilable enemies. If it wasn't for this scheme, we would definitely choose to cooperate now. One of the eighth tribulation powerhouses sighed, feeling an even stronger sense of helplessness in his heart. The more wondrous and mysterious the fruit of the way, the more they desired it. If their thirst for the fruits of way increased to a certain level, then the cooperation between them would be a matter of course. Even if this kind of cooperation was a little embarrassing to deal with a seventh tribulation powerhouse, for the sake of obtaining the mysteries of the fruit of the way, they would absolutely not hesitate. But obviously, this was only the beginning. Now, even if they clearly knew that the conflict between them was part of Luo Fan's scheme, and that he had deliberately created it. But the source of the conflict was already deeply hidden, and it was already impossible for them to cooperate. Facing this situation, all of the Eighth Tribulation powerhouses sighed inwardly. Facing the current situation, they felt a sense of helplessness that they hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of helplessness towards a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. Chapter 32:22. Of course, even if the situation was so bad for the Eighth Tribulation experts, they were still Eighth Tribulation experts after all. Even if Luo Fan had the fruit of ways, he still needed to carry out all sorts of plans and tests in order to deal with them. From this, it could be seen how much pressure their existence brought to Luo Fan. How could an existence that could bring such pressure to Luo Fan be simple? From all aspects, it seemed like these Eighth Tribulation experts were already completely under Luo Fan's control. It seemed like no matter how it developed, it was impossible for them to escape from his control. However, that was only what it seemed like. These Eighth Tribulation experts still had many ways to escape from his control. If Luo Fan wasn't careful, the situation could even be completely reversed. In fact, it was precisely because of this confidence that these Eighth Tribulation experts were so calm. Even if they had to make a choice, if they didn't have the confidence, they would still be able to show it in their performance. It was impossible for Luo Fan to not sense the confidence of these Eighth Tribulation experts. If he really didn't sense it, he wouldn't be so cautious at this moment. However, no matter how cautious and careful he was, his ultimate goal was to offend those Eight Tribulation experts. He was ultimately going against the interests of those Eight Tribulation experts. Therefore, in the end, he would still truly touch the bottom line of these Eighth Tribulation experts, causing them to have no choice but to reveal their trump cards to resist him. For example, right now, after much pressure and pressure, one of the Eighth Tribulation experts could no longer endure it. He was unwilling to endure it any longer. If this continues, all my secrets will be grasped by him. At that time, not to mention me, even my main body will be in great danger. This thought gradually emerged in his mind. With this thought, he finally made up his mind. He would rather break away from the fruit of ways than continue to endure this kind of treatment. As he made up his mind, Luo Fan suddenly felt that in the countless possibilities of the future, this Eighth Tribulation expert had already disappeared without a trace. Even in the past that he could change at will, the existence of this Eighth Tribulation expert could no longer be found. It seemed that at some point in time, this Eighth Tribulation expert only had the present. There was no longer a past or a future. This state seemed to be somewhat similar to the state in which a portion of the Sixth Tribulation experts sacrificed their future to obtain strength that far exceeded what they had in the endless world. But in essence they were completely different. Back then, that Sixth Tribulation expert's incarnation had completely sacrificed his future, transforming it into power and releasing it. From that moment on, it was impossible for him to have a future. It was impossible for him to find his future again. But this Eighth Tribulation expert was completely different. What he was doing was gathering the past and the future, gathering both of them into the present at the same time. In other words, the current him had been greatly expanded. Not only did it encompass the present, it also encompassed the present, and it even encompassed the past. Although this process was extremely similar to the Sixth Tribulation expert sacrificing his entire future, the essence was clearly completely different. Not to mention anything else, just in terms of reversibility, what this Eighth Tribulation expert did was not something that the Sixth Tribulation expert's incarnation could compare to. It was already completely impossible for the Sixth Tribulation expert's incarnation to have a future again. And for this Eighth Tribulation expert to have a future again, He only needed to release the future that he had gathered with this change. Luo Fan instantly felt that the eighth tribulation master seemed to have turned into a stone that fell heavily into his body and couldn't be digested. As for the various kinds of control he had over this eighth tribulation expert, he naturally completely lost it at this moment. It's finally easy. The eighth tribulation expert let out a long sigh. Then, his body shook, and he suddenly broke free from countless indescribable invisible restraints. In another flash, he had already traversed through countless obstacles and arrived at a special location in this boundless world. This place seemed to be no different from any other place in the endless world. However, in the eyes of the eighth tribulation expert, this was the most special place in the endless world seed. If one were to look at it from a macroscopic perspective, this place would be the highest level of existence in the endless world. In other words, it was the place closest to the divided fruit of Tao. At this moment, although the eighth tribulation expert seemed to only be standing there, in reality, his figure seemed to have been suddenly cloned countless times, and was divided into countless layers of island branches. Moreover, all of the figures seemed to be faintly discernible. None of them were real, and none of them were more solid than the others. At this moment, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. The change in front of him was beyond his expectations. He didn't expect that the eighth tribulation expert could actually approach the divided fruit of Tao in this way. Before, he had only thought of stepping directly into the main body of the divided fruit of Wei, which was the island above the sea of nothingness. Alternatively, he could use a clone to step into a branch of the island and step into the divided fruit of Wei. And now, this eighth tribulation powerhouse had presented a third possibility to him. At this moment, he didn't exist in the divided fruit of Tao as a part, nor did he step into the divided fruit of Tao as a whole. Instead, he was in a state between a part and a whole. It was as if he had billions of clones, or as if his entire body had been divided into countless illusory yet real images. This method was so mysterious and profound that not only did Luo Fan have a better understanding of the eighth tribulation expert's methods, but he also had a deeper understanding of the divided fruit of Tao. However, at this moment, he clearly couldn't immerse himself in these two things for too long. Because the eighth tribulation expert clearly didn't come here to show him his methods, of course. He had a deeper purpose for coming here. At this moment, an indescribable light flashed through the eighth tribulation expert's eyes, and a subtle aura flashed across his body. It was as if he alone was all-encompassing, containing all of heaven and earth, all of the world, all of space, and even all of time. Then, he suddenly raised his hand and slapped forward. At this moment, the entire divided fruit of Tao began to shake violently. It was as if something was being slapped by some huge force. Although the palm of the eighth tribulation powerhouse was pointing at nothingness, Luo Fan could faintly feel that the palm was pointing at him. If he could observe the countless possibilities of the future, Luo Fan would naturally be able to easily see the effects, methods, details, and even many more wonderful mysteries of this move. However, it was clear that although he could still see the future possibilities of everything else, he was powerless against this eighth tribulation expert who had gathered the past, present, and future into the present. At this moment, he could only use his own deduction and guess to understand the method that the eighth tribulation expert was using. And obviously, not only was it more difficult, but the effectiveness was also greatly limited. Originally, as soon as the eighth tribulation expert made a decision, he might have been able to see everything clearly and understand everything clearly. But now, he probably had to wait for the eighth tribulation expert's method to truly take effect. Only when it truly erupted would he be able to see the true effects. And at this moment, it might already be too slow, just like at this moment, he couldn't truly see through the true mysteries of the eighth tribulation expert's method. He could only watch helplessly as the palm touched the essence of the fruit of separation in a way he could not understand, causing the fruit of separation to show strange signs of instability. As the split Tao fruit became unstable, the absolute control it had over everything within it relaxed slightly in that instant. This sort of relaxation had no effect on those who had transcended. After all, even the strongest among those who had transcended were only sixth tribulation experts. Compared to existences at the level of the Tao fruit, sixth tribulation experts were far too lacking. Not to mention the fact that the Tao fruit was only slightly unstable. Even if 90% of the Tao fruit collapsed, they wouldn't be able to resist its influence. Under such circumstances, how could he have sensed the minute changes in the Tao fruit of division? However, it was clear that this was only the case for those who had transcended the world. For some existences in this endless world, or rather, within the divided fruit of Tao, the instability of the Tao fruit was as obvious as the heavens and earth turning upside down. As for which existences could clearly sense the instability of the divided fruit of Tao, was there a need to say more? Of course, it was those eighth tribulation experts. For these eighth tribulation experts, they paid close attention to all changes in the divided fruit of Tao. Even if there weren't any changes, they had to see some changes so that they could dig out some of the mysteries of the divided fruit of Tao. It would be best if they could figure out why an existence that wasn't even a ninth tribulation expert could condense such a divided fruit of Tao. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how obvious the instability caused by the splitting of the Tao fruit was in their eyes at this time. This is the best chance to escape. As long as I can escape, I'll have a chance to turn the tables and obtain his secrets. At this moment, these eighth tribulation experts all had similar thoughts. Escape didn't just refer to leaving the divided fruit of Tao and the endless world. Escape referred to breaking free from the control of the divided fruit of Tao and the shackles of the divided fruit of Tao. Obviously, for these eighth tribulation experts, if they could really break free from the shackles and the control, then they would naturally be able to comprehend many secrets about the divided fruit of Tao from the process that they couldn't comprehend before. And for existences at their level, as long as they grasped the secrets, there were too many things they could do. It was naturally a bit exaggerated to say that they could completely turn the tables on the divided fruit of Tao, but it wasn't surprising at all to say that they could turn the tables on the divided fruit of Tao and obtain its secrets. Because of this, these eighth tribulation experts were so excited at this moment. However, from this, it could be seen how effective Luo Fan's previous actions were. After Luo Fan's schemes, the conflict and hatred between these eighth tribulation experts had long become deeply rooted. Just how great was the level of hatred? It had reached the point where even if the opportunity to escape was right in front of them, they were still willing to take some time out to cause trouble for the other eighth tribulation experts. Of course, this was also because they were confident enough. Because they were confident enough, they felt that even if they wasted a bit of time to disturb others, they would still be able to escape safely. It wouldn't affect their goal too much. Thus, at this moment, they didn't feel any pressure at all to disturb the other eighth tribulation experts. However, it was clear that they had forgotten one fact. That was that while they had an irreconcilable hatred for others, others also had similar feelings for them. In other words, if they disturbed others, others would also interfere with them. In this way, the result was very obvious. If they were the only ones interfering with others, and the others didn't interfere with them, then their scheme would naturally succeed easily. Everything would develop according to their plan. In other words, they could interfere with others, but at the same time, they could preserve enough energy to escape safely. However, it was clear that after the others interfered with them, the amount of energy they originally had was naturally insufficient. Thus, in the end, under all sorts of strange interference, none of the 6 eighth tribulation experts could seize the opportunity to escape while the divided fruit of Tao was unstable. What a pity! When this opportunity passed, all the eighth tribulation experts felt that it was a pity. However, although they felt that it was a pity, none of them regretted their previous actions. Even if they could go back in time, they wouldn't change what they did. The reason was very simple. It was because their hatred for the other eighth tribulation experts was real. Chapter 32:23. As an eighth tribulation powerhouse, to say that they were able to see their own nature was an underestimation of their temperament. This was a good thing in other aspects. It was enough for them to gain advantages in cultivation, comprehension, battle, exploration, and other aspects. However, obviously, nothing was perfect. At least, this was the case for many levels below true divine. This kind of temperament allowed them to gain advantages and convenience in many aspects. However, in other aspects, this kind of temperament didn't just bring convenience and advantage. For example, now, because they had a clear understanding of themselves, they were able to see their own nature. This caused them to become as stubborn and unshakable as a rock once they established their views and had hatred. After all, because they were able to see their own nature, they knew what they thought and what were external attachments. In this way, once a contradiction was created and hatred was established, it would become a real contradiction and a real hatred. This kind of hatred could only be washed away by the other party's death. Other than that, there was no other way to wash away this contradiction and hatred. Because of this, they knew that they had wasted a good opportunity. They knew that their choice wasn't a perfect one, could even be called a stupid one. However, they didn't care at all. They didn't regret it at all. At this time, after feeling pity, they all turned their gazes to the eighth tribulation powerhouse who caused the fruit of Tao to become unstable. The location of this eighth tribulation powerhouse was so special that his traces could be seen in almost all the branches of the island. It was so obvious. How could the other eighth tribulation powerhouses not notice this abnormality? Once they noticed this abnormality, they naturally understood the source of the fruit of Tao's abnormality. After knowing that it was the source, the attitude of these eighth tribulation powerhouses towards him was self-evident. After all, under Luo Fan's plan, the contradiction between them was between two parties, not just one party. In other words, between any two of them, there was an irreconcilable hatred. In this way, they were also irreconcilable with the eighth tribulation powerhouse who caused the abnormality in the fruit of Tao's division. In this way, when they found out what this powerhouse was doing, even if they knew that it was beneficial to them, as long as it was beneficial to him, they couldn't just sit back and watch. He had to make a move to create trouble for him. If an eighth tribulation expert were to make trouble for the eighth tribulation expert who had caused the Tao fruit to become unstable, he would naturally be successful. At the very least, he would be able to make the eighth tribulation expert feel that he was making trouble for him. However, it was clear that it was not just an eighth tribulation expert who was preparing to take action at this time. Instead, they were 6 eighth tribulation experts who had irreconcilable grudges against each other. This situation seemed to be even more dangerous, but in fact, this dangerous situation was naturally the result of their cooperation. Not only did they not cooperate, but they even hindered each other. The situation was completely reversed. If you want to do something, I will stop you. What I want to do, he stops me, and what he wants to do, you stop him. In this way, it was almost self-evident what would happen if they attacked at the same time. In the end, they would achieve nothing, even if it was to bring trouble to their common enemy, even if it was to let them vent the hatred and anger in their hearts, it was still the same. As a result, in the end, there were countless disturbances in the endless world because of their attack. It even made people suspect that the endless world was about to be completely destroyed. However, the eighth tribulation cultivator who was attacking the fruit of ways did not sense any powerful disturbances. He did not even pay much attention to them. This situation made the eighth tribulation powerhouses feel pity in their hearts. Of course, at the same time, they didn't regret it. Even if they were given another chance, they would still do the same thing. Just what kind of existences are they? Why are they so terrifying? In the dark, the many transcendent experts were transmitting their thoughts to each other. And among them, this was the one with the most thoughts. Truly, the shock that the eighth tribulation experts brought to the transcendent experts was just too strong. They were so strong that they couldn't even imagine that such powerful and terrifying existences could exist. Even though they had opened up the cultivation path of the endless world to the sixth tribulation level, even though their understanding of cultivation had reached an unimaginable depth, they were still confused by the changes in front of them. They couldn't understand what kind of existences the eighth tribulation experts were. They didn't know what the limits of their strength were, and they didn't understand how they had cultivated to such a powerful level. Despite this shock, they were more cautious than ever. Even though the disturbance caused by the eighth tribulation experts seemed to be about to completely destroy the endless world, as if the entire endless world was about to be overturned by them, as long as it didn't really happen, they could only pretend that nothing had happened. They even tried their best to hide their presence, let alone stop the eighth tribulation experts. However, not doing anything didn't mean that they didn't feel emotional, nor did it mean that they had to obediently accept everything the eighth tribulation experts had done. At this moment, they were actually doing their best to collect everything that the eighth tribulation experts revealed. They wanted to figure out the bottom line of their strength through what they revealed, and even find a way to deal with them. Thus, although it looked calm on the surface, the communication channel of the Supreme Transcendence was bustling with noise and excitement. Practically at every moment, there were billions of transcendent experts guessing the eighth tribulation experts from various angles. Naturally, it was impossible to gain much from such a guess. After all, even the strongest among the transcendent experts was only a sixth tribulation expert. Compared to the eighth tribulation experts, there was still a seventh tribulation stage between them. However, there was a huge gap between each stage of the tribulation realm. It was easy to imagine how incredible the gap between the two stages was. Under such circumstances, they looked at this eighth tribulation expert like an ant looking at the universe. Clearly, for ants, no matter how they looked, they couldn't see the complete picture of the universe. In fact, they would even think of countless other things as the complete picture of the universe. To these transcendents, these eighth tribulation experts were like the universe itself, and they were like ants. As a result, even if the eighth tribulation experts used all of their techniques, the sixth tribulation experts might not be able to gain much from it, let alone the eighth tribulation experts who only used some of their technique. However, even though it couldn't be said to be enough to satisfy them, they were still facing existences that were at least 2 realms higher than them. The various techniques that they had displayed contained boundless profundities that they couldn't even imagine. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for them to not gain anything. Seeing the various techniques the eighth tribulation experts displayed, all the transcendent experts vaguely felt that an incomparably bright future was unfolding in front of them. In a daze, they seemed to see the direction of the future, and they discovered where their future lay. Unknowingly, their cultivation realms had also begun to improve. Compared to before, this time, the higher their cultivation realm, the faster their cultivation realm increased. The reason for this was naturally not because it was easier to increase one's cultivation realm. The difficulty of increasing did not change. The higher one's cultivation realm, the more difficult it was to increase. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because the mysteries displayed by the eighth tribulation experts could only be sensed clearly by those with higher cultivation realm. On the contrary, the weaker one was, the less they could sense it. That was why the current situation occurred. The higher one's cultivation realm was, the faster their cultivation realm increased. Of course, no matter how fast it was, the higher one's cultivation realm was, the less progress they could make. After all, the higher one's cultivation realm was, the greater the gap between realms. This meant that if one wanted to cross the same distance, the higher one's cultivation realm was, the greater the gap between realms. And at this time, this gap was even greater than the gains of these transcendents as their realms increased. It was because of that they ended up in this sort of situation. However, even with such a good harvest, these transcendent experts were still not satisfied. They were all extremely nervous, ready to pay any price to stop that eighth tribulation expert. After all, compared to everything else, a large number of transcendent experts were more concerned about the safety of the endless world. Even if they had to pay with their lives for the safety of the endless world, a large number of transcendent experts were willing to do so. As for sacrificing their own benefits for the endless world, there were naturally even more transcendent experts who were willing to do so. However, it was unknown whether it was a coincidence or not. In short, no matter how powerful the eighth tribulation experts were, in the end, it was all bark and no bite. The damage they caused to the endless world could be said to be negligible. At first, the transcendent experts did not notice this, but as time passed, they soon noticed it. The transcendent experts below the sixth tribulation were still confused, but the sixth tribulation experts already understood many things. He is the one controlling all of this. This thought flashed through the minds of the sixth tribulation experts. The he they were referring to was naturally the master behind the fruit of division of Tao, Luo Fan. Compared to the native transcendent experts, the majority of the sixth tribulation experts came from the endless world, in other words, from the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. Under such circumstances, their knowledge was far greater than that of the natives who had transcended the world. The native transcendent experts could only rely on all kinds of reliable and unreliable guesses to doubt the existence of Luo Fan. However, the level 6 experts had long since confirmed that there was an incredible expert behind the endless world, controlling everything. Under such circumstances, the eighth tribulation experts' various methods coincidentally caused such a huge movement, but did not cause real damage to the endless world. For them, this was simply as obvious as lice on a bald man's head. Apart from the existence behind the endless world being affected by all these changes and limiting the impact of these changes on the endless world, what other possibilities could there be? He is actually so powerful, no wonder he could attract them. Those experts who thought of this instantly became inexplicably complicated. The existence behind the endless world was able to limit the eighth tribulation experts' methods, which naturally showed that he had at least the same strength as them. At least he could exert the same strength as them. But if he could exert the same strength as them, then it was quite obvious why these incredible experts had come. The experts would not be attracted by the weak. Only the strong could attract the experts. Although they were unwilling to admit it, these transcendent experts were very clear that with their strength, they could not attract the eighth tribulation experts. In this way, these eighth tribulation experts could only have been attracted here because of the existence behind this endless world. Why on earth are they here? Is it because of the wonders of this place? Or is it because of some more incredible reason? After they confirmed the reason for the arrival of the eighth tribulation experts, they began to investigate further to find the reason for their arrival. Sometimes, grasping the enemy's goal was equivalent to grasping the key to victory. Therefore, even if they were much weaker than the eighth tribulation experts, as long as they knew the goal of the eighth tribulation experts and grasped the key they were looking for, they would naturally be able to gain an absolute advantage in the plans of the eighth tribulation experts. Even directly suppressing the eighth tribulation experts and obtaining the final victory was not an extravagant hope. It wasn't just one or two transcendent experts who thought of this, but tens of millions or even billions of transcendent experts. As a result, this kind of thinking quickly became the main topic of conversation between the transcendent existences throughout the world. Chapter 32-24. If the eighth tribulation experts wanted to know about the conversation between the transcendent experts, they could easily do so. After all, their levels were much higher than those transcendent realm experts. However, it was clear that the eighth tribulation experts were not interested in the transcendent experts at all at this moment. At this moment, they were thinking about each other and the mysteries of the Tao fruit division. It was clear that this was enough to take up all their energy. How could they have the energy to pay attention to the conversation between the transcendent experts? Because of their involvement with each other, the eighth tribulation experts would not be able to accomplish anything even if they wanted to work together. However, this was only in the context of working together. Under normal circumstances, once they threw caution to the wind, they could easily accomplish whatever they wanted to do. After all, it was not yet time for them to throw caution to the wind and create trouble for others. Therefore, once someone threw caution to the wind and wanted to do something, he would naturally be able to break through the troubles the other eighth tribulation experts had created for him and achieve his goal. Just like the eighth tribulation expert who was in an extremely special position within the Tao fruit division. At this moment, he was willing to throw caution to the wind and truly touch the Tao fruit division. Therefore, he had truly achieved something at this moment. Previously, he had shaken the Tao fruit division and caused the entire Tao fruit division to tremble violently. This was part of his success. Although the reason why he was able to do this was because the other eight tribulation experts didn't have a clear grasp of his position, it was more because he was the first to throw caution to the wind. The obstruction of the other eight tribulation experts didn't have much effect on him, who threw caution to the wind at this moment. He was still in that extremely special position. His figure seemed to have split into countless images that merged into the nearly endless branches of the island. To a certain extent, this change was already close to touching the essence of the Tao fruit division. However, it was only the essence of the division and not the essence of the Tao fruit division. After all, the Tao fruit division involved the mysteries of division. And wasn't the eighth tribulation expert's current performance a manifestation of countless divisions? The eighth tribulation expert seemed to have sensed this as well. However, it was clear that this was meaningless to the eighth tribulation expert. That was because what he wanted was the mysteries contained within the Tao fruit, not the mysteries of the Tao fruit itself. The mysteries of simple division were actually no secret to this eighth tribulation expert. With the cultivation of an eighth tribulation expert, with his knowledge and methods, he had already grasped the secret of division long ago. However, it was clear that the division of the Tao fruit was so profound that it could suppress these eighth tribulation cultivators and even control their past, present, and future. The true mystery lay in the Tao fruit, not in the division. The reason why the Tao fruit of division was called the Tao fruit of division was actually the deterioration of the Tao fruit. The division Tao fruit was said to be a type of Tao fruit, but it was actually the product of extracting a portion of the true origin Tao fruit's characteristics and combining it with the mysteries of division. In other words, the profundities of division were just dregs in the Tao fruit of division. If it weren't for the fact that removing it would make the Tao fruit incomplete and impossible to form, Luo Fan might have been even more willing to remove it. After all, after removing the dregs, the Tao fruit would become even purer and would be one step closer to the origin Tao fruit. And now, what the eighth tribulation expert had obtained was a portion of the dregs. At this moment, what he was displaying was the profoundness of the power of division. His body split into countless branches of the island, making him feel like he had split into billions of parts and had billions of parts at the same time. No matter how much of the mystery of division was the dregs of the Tao fruit of division, it was still a part of the Tao fruit of division. Under these circumstances, after mastering this mystery, there would naturally be a certain degree of resonance between the Tao fruit of division and the Tao fruit of division. During this resonance, the eighth tribulation expert could faintly feel the vastness and grandeur of the Tao fruit of division itself. This was a kind of vastness and grandeur that even an eighth tribulation expert had never felt before. This was a kind of vastness and grandeur of the past, present, and future. In that instant, he felt as if he had touched upon the mysteries that he was pursuing. No wonder he can control me. At this moment, this thought appeared in the eighth tribulation expert's mind. Shortly after, this feeling began to quickly fade. In a trance, he felt like he had been beaten back to his original form, and the subtle resonance with the Tao fruit of division quickly faded. It was as if the Tao fruit of division was adjusting itself to strike him out of this state of resonance. No. At this moment, the eighth tribulation expert's expression changed greatly, and he roared in his heart. As this roar came from the bottom of his heart, as endless power surged in his body, his past, present, and future shrank even further. An indescribable brilliance was released from his body as it shrank, making him seem as if he was fusing with the void, about to completely disappear into it. Facing this situation, a strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and there were countless flashes of light in his eyes. At this moment, the eighth tribulation expert no longer had past, present, and future in his eyes. There was only this instant. In this situation, he naturally couldn't see through his past, present, and future through the Tao fruit of division, nor could he deduce how to obtain the best result through the countless possibilities of the future. At this moment, he felt like he had lost the Tao fruit of division. In fact, compared to losing the Tao fruit of division, this feeling was even worse. This was because in the past, even though he had lost the Tao fruit of division, he could still vaguely see the various possibilities of the future with his strength. Although it wasn't like when he had the Tao fruit of division, where he could see countless possibilities, nor could he grasp the possibilities of the future, it was still not completely blurry. But now, he couldn't even see the slightest possibility of the future. Of course, when he said that he couldn't see the possibility of the future, it wasn't that he couldn't see the possibility of the future at all. On the contrary, at this moment, he could still see the countless possibilities of the future, and he could even grasp the countless possibilities of the future. However, the eighth tribulation expert didn't exist in those possibilities of the future. Those possibilities of the future all didn't include the eighth tribulation expert's future. Clearly, when facing the eighth tribulation expert, this kind of future possibility was no different from not seeing it at all. That was why he said that he couldn't see the possibilities of the future anymore. This feeling, at this time, was naturally an extremely novel feeling for Luo Fan. He felt like he was creating new history and new possibilities with every passing moment. At this moment, the eighth tribulation expert's body lit up and his palm slapped towards the void in front of him. With this slap, the boundless world started to tremble violently. As long as the world was within the Tao fruit of division, it would start to tremble violently because of this slap. It was as if this slap wasn't acting on the void, but on the entire world. Faced with this situation, the countless transcendent beings were even more shocked. They were even more shocked by the might of the eighth tribulation experts. Along with this shock, they were even more eager to find the reason why the eighth tribulation experts were in this boundless world. After all, the more powerful they were, the more worth investigating the reason why they were in this boundless world. However, it was clear that if they wanted to find the reason why the eighth tribulation experts were here, they could only rely on their own guesses and thoughts. As for the specifics, they weren't too sure why those eighth tribulation experts were there. After all, even a sixth tribulation expert was still far inferior to an eighth tribulation expert. This difference in level made it impossible for them to understand the thoughts of the eighth tribulation experts. Of course, it was even more impossible for them to determine the reason why they were here. However, there were still countless transcendent beings. Even if it was just pure guesses, they wouldn't be completely fruitless. In the end, they combined the changes in the past that the 6 tribulation experts had sensed through their main bodies and vaguely guessed that the 8 tribulation experts might have been interested in this endless world because of the changes in the past that had happened in this endless world before. That was why they had stayed here. Although they didn't know what this change in the past meant, the 6th tribulation experts still had a general concept of time. The past was eternal and immovable. It couldn't be changed. The 6th tribulation experts understood this very well. But something that had changed the past in this boundless world was an extremely incredible change, no matter how they looked at it. And the existence that could cause such a change was naturally also an incredible existence. In this way, it wasn't unimaginable that it could attract the 8th tribulation expert. However, as mentioned before, all of this could only be guesses. They didn't have any evidence to prove this at all. They didn't even have any arguments that could make them sure of this. He seems to have gained something. At this time, the remaining 6 8th tribulation experts had more guesses in their heart. No matter how one looked at it, the performance of the 8th tribulation expert, who had been divided into countless images, seemed like he had gained something, but was suddenly cut off. Now, he was trying his best to get back the harvest. Those transcendent beings couldn't see this, but how could they, who were also 8th tribulation experts, not see this? We can't let him get more. At this time, the 8th tribulation experts all had this thought. With this thought in mind, they couldn't help but start to attack the 8th tribulation expert. Puffed, puffed, puffed for a moment. It was unknown how many images that the 8th tribulation expert had divided into countless island branches were directly destroyed. Just as the light sound was heard, if this situation were to continue, the outcome for the 8th tribulation powerhouse would be worrying. However, it was obvious that the current situation couldn't continue like this, because the 8th tribulation experts had also discovered each other's actions. The reason why they had been so successful before was because they had only targeted the projection of the island branch they were on and the projection of the island branch near these islands. Because the distance was relatively close, they had already achieved their goal with just a thought. Even if the other 8th tribulation experts discovered each other's actions, they wouldn't be able to take action in time. That was why their movements were so straightforward and nimble. However, it was obvious that this situation couldn't continue after they attacked once. For the 8th tribulation experts, even the barriers between the island branches were nothing to them. As long as they discovered each other, as long as they were willing, they could easily attack through countless island branches. At this time, would they attack each other? Was there a need to say? Of course they would. Although at this time, they all wanted to prevent the 8th tribulation expert, who had divided into countless images, from obtaining more benefits. It seemed that they had the same goal and had the basis for cooperation. Even if they discovered each other, they should pretend that they hadn't discovered each other and solve the most important conflict first. However, this was just the concept of mortals. For these 8th tribulation experts, their concept was obviously not like this. For these 8th tribulation experts, they didn't put interests above hatred. To them, what they felt in their hearts was the most important. And hatred was obviously related to their own feelings. If they gave up on hatred and first cooperated to deal with the 8th tribulation expert, who had already obtained some results and seemed to be one step closer to obtaining more results, they would be able to obtain the most benefit. In the end, it would benefit all of them. However, it was obvious that cooperating with other 8th tribulation experts would not satisfy their hatred, and it would distort their minds. And this distortion was obviously unacceptable to these 8th tribulation experts. Therefore, the final development of the matter was very obvious. At this time, those 8th tribulation experts directly gave up on the 8th tribulation expert who had already divided into countless images. Instead, they turned their target to the other 8th tribulation experts and began to constantly hinder the other 8th tribulation experts. Chapter 32:25. In a situation where they were hindering each other, the final result of those eighth tribulation experts was very similar to before. All of them returned empty-handed and accomplished nothing, of course. If it was considered an achievement to make the eighth tribulation expert who was fighting against the splitting of the Tao fruits slightly shift his attention to them, then it was clearly an achievement. That's right, what they had achieved now was only to make the eighth tribulation expert slightly shift his attention to the eighth tribulation experts who were dragging each other down. At that moment, the eighth tribulation expert already knew that even though he seemed to have touched the Tao fruit of division, he was still unable to do so. However, there was still a long way to go before he could truly achieve his objective and figure out the various profundities hidden within the Tao fruit. Under such circumstances, if he were to continue like this, he would only be repeating the previous process. Perhaps he would be able to learn more about the mysteries of division and get closer to the essence of division within the fruit of Tao. However, it would be extremely unlikely for him to truly obtain the essence of the fruit of Tao. Furthermore, just like how other eighth tribulation experts couldn't help but attack others due to their hatred and anger, he also had similar feelings towards other eighth tribulation experts. Therefore, at this moment, when he noticed the other 8 tribulation experts, his instinct urged him to deal with them. His instincts were urging him, but his rationality was telling him that it would be difficult for him to reap any benefits if he continued with his previous actions. That was to say, it was urgent for him to change. In this way, the result was very obvious. Therefore, in the next moment, the 8th tribulation powerhouse instantly changed his target. He had already poured half of the power that belonged to him into the fruit of Wei, and he had yet to use it up. Now, he turned towards the 6 8th tribulation powerhouses among the many branches of the islands. In that instant, the 8th tribulation experts felt an incomparably strong sense of danger drowning them. At the same time, in the boundless world, all the transcending experts felt as if the end of the world had arrived. The boundless world was about to be completely destroyed, and they felt as if it was going to disappear. The reason why only those who transcended all over the world felt this way wasn't because they were weaker than ordinary creatures, or because their ability to endure pressure was worse. Instead, it was because in this boundless world, only those who had transcended could sense the power of an 8th tribulation cultivator erupting. Apart from them, no other living beings knew about the existence of this power. If he didn't even have the ability to sense the existence of such power, how could he react to the existence of such power? Naturally, it was impossible for them to have any special emotions or have any panic. Damn it, have they lost their patience? Do they want to destroy the boundless world? At this time, those transcending experts all roared in despair. However, their roars were as insignificant as the cries of ants in the face of a natural disaster. They did not attract anyone's attention at all, let alone have any effect on the outbreak of the disaster. At this moment, the 6 8th tribulation experts, who were originally holding back, took action at the same time. In that instant, their auras began to swell wildly. His past, present, and future also began to rapidly shrink at this moment. From their originally scattered state, they shrunk into a ball into a single point. And with this change, not only did they break free from the control of the split Tao fruit, at least Luo Fan could no longer use it to control the endless possibilities of the future. Moreover, they could greatly increase their strength, even by 1,000 times. The reason why they could erupt was because this state was similar to sacrificing the past, present, and future at the same time. Once these 3 were sacrificed at the same time, it didn't need to be said how much stronger they would become. Back then, when the incarnations of the 6th tribulation experts sacrificed their entire bodies, the strength they would obtain in the future was already displayed vividly in this state. Although there was an essential difference between the shrinking of the bodies of the 8th tribulation experts and the sacrifice, they could still recover and find their past, present, and future. Under such circumstances, it was equivalent to their sacrifice not being complete. Naturally, the strength they could get back would be much weaker than if they had completely sacrificed themselves. However, they were still eighth tribulation experts in the end. Although this state had the taste of sacrificing the past, present, and future, it was still just a taste. As eighth tribulation experts, how could it be so simple as to just turn the sacrifice into a normal state? There were also countless new characteristics brought about by the shrinking of the past, present, and future into a ball. These characteristics allowed them to possess endless power, divine abilities, wondrous techniques, and all sorts of even more inconceivable existences that they didn't have before. When all of this was interwoven together, it allowed them to unleash power that was thousands of times greater than that of an actual sacrifice, even if it seemed to be an incomplete sacrifice. Of course, even Luo Fan was a bit confused by the true profundities, let alone those who had transcended. For those who had transcended, this kind of confusion was enough to make them feel despair, because at this time, this kind of confusion would cut off their last hope, shrouding their future in bottomless darkness. However, the situation was clearly different for Luo Fan. For Luo Fan, this kind of confusion made him look forward to the eighth tribulation experts even more, and he was even more motivated to cultivate. After all, even with the fruit of separation, the eighth tribulation experts still could not look down on them. They still could not completely ignore all the profundities within them. This kind of realm clearly had endless value. However, although he greatly looked forward to the eighth tribulation experts' methods, he could not allow them to unleash their strength without concealing it and destroy the endless world. If the endless world had not been refined into the fruit of separation before, perhaps he would have valued it, but he would not have insisted on preserving it. If the destruction of the endless world could make things a little more convenient for him and allow him to obtain some of the things he wanted, he definitely would not feel the slightest heartache. However, it was clear that the endless world had now been refined into the fruit of separation. After being refined to this level, the value of the endless world was obviously completely different from before to Luo Fan. It was self-evident how attractive an existence that could make a ninth tribulation expert want to explore it was to Luo Fan. Even if Luo Fan had always acted like he did not care about most of the benefits and seemed a little aloof, the benefits that he did not care about did not include the benefits of cultivation. It did not include the benefits that would help him improve. And obviously, the existence of the fruit of separation belonged to the kind of benefits that he absolutely needed to care about. Since such benefits could reach the level of a ninth tribulation expert's heart, how could he not care about it? Therefore, at this time, to him, the fruit of separation was clearly not something that he could give up at all. At least, for the time being, he could not give it up at all. Therefore, at this time, he directly started to make adjustments to the past, present, and future of the endless world. In this process of adjustment, the endless world underwent a subtle change. Under the change, the place where the eighth tribulation experts had unleashed their endless attacks had all turned into an empty space. The entire process was extremely natural. Even the supreme transcendents were completely unable to sense that this situation was not a new change. They only felt that the endless world had been like this since ancient times. The attacks from the eighth tribulation experts' interweaving powers were like the void between the heaven and earth. It was like the void of nothingness. There was nothing that they cared about. Of course, the sixth tribulation experts did not sense this change. They were only limited to their incarnations in the endless world. Although it had not happened yet, when they exchanged information with their true bodies, they would naturally know that the past had been changed. However, it was clear that this was not the time for them to exchange information with their true bodies. After all, the sixth tribulation experts could not exchange information with their true bodies all the time. Therefore, it was completely correct to say that none of the supreme transcendents could sense that the past had been changed. This is indeed the fruit of Tao. At this time, the Eighth Tribulation experts all felt inexplicably emotional. They were excited, expectant, and helpless. The reason why they stayed here, and wanted to explore the endless world, was because Luo Fan had changed the past in the endless world's tribulation, which attracted their attention. Because, as Eighth Tribulation experts, they knew the existence of the fruit of Tao. Although they had never really seen it, but the endless world's method of changing the past was very similar to the legendary fruit of Tao. Therefore, they stopped their cultivation on the 6th level of the Tao Master's path and turned their attention to the endless world. They wanted to explore the fruit of Tao in this way. Of course, before this, no matter how confident they were, they dared not truly believe that this was the fruit of Tao. They did not dare to be truly sure that this was the product of the 7th Tribulation experts, and that it was the fruit of Tao that they had only heard of in legends. Only now, when they truly saw the ability of the fruit of Tao to change the past directly in front of them, did they truly believe this. As for why Luo Fan had changed the past so many times before, and even made them irreconcilable enemies with each other through this change, it was only now that they truly witnessed the ability of the Tao fruit of division to change the past. Naturally, the reason was that only now did the traces of Luo Fan's changes to the past truly appear in front of them. He did not completely avoid them. And because they had shrunk the past, present, and future, they had completely broken free from the control of the fruit of Tao. This combination naturally allowed them to see the changes to the past with unprecedented clarity. At this moment, the importance of the fruit of Tao in the Eighth Tribulation experts' hearts suddenly increased by a lot. This increase in importance was not enough to completely suppress their hatred for each other. But in the end, this hatred was still suppressed, so that they did not place this hatred too far above the task of exploring the fruit of Tao. In other words, as the importance they placed on the fruit of Tao increased, they could not ignore their hatred and cooperate with each other to explore the fruit of Tao. However, they would not be like before, where they would destroy anything that was done by others no matter what. At the very least, they could consider their own interests and see if what others did interfered with what they wanted to do. If there was no interference, there was a high chance that they would ignore it, and the greatest significance of this change was that these Eighth Tribulation experts would no longer completely fail in everything they did because they were hindering each other. Although failure would still be the majority, at least there was a chance of success. Of course, this was a matter for the future. At this moment, the might of these Eighth Tribulation experts had already collided with each other. It was to the point that they almost completely overturned the endless world, causing the endless world to be turned upside down and destroyed. Under such circumstances, how could they just act as if nothing had happened and ignore each other? Of course, they would first endure this wave of battle before anything else. As for whether they would mind their own business after that, no one would care about how others explored, or whether they would deal with someone first before exploring. That would depend on the outcome of the following battle. At this moment, these Eighth Tribulation experts had already revealed their trump cards, or at least a portion of them. The power that erupted from them had even seeped out of the fruit of Tao, which was to say, outside the endless world. Under this kind of seeping, countless Sixth Tribulation experts felt as if they had turned into ants and were being looked down upon by a terrifying divine dragon. They felt that even the slightest movement would attract a destructive attack. What's going on inside? At this moment, this thought flashed through the minds of countless Sixth Tribulation experts, causing their expressions to become extremely grave. Of course, during this process, they obeyed their will and didn't dare to move at all. Chapter 32:26. At this moment, the power that made the Sixth Tribulation experts around the island feel extremely dangerous suddenly disappeared without a trace. However, although the power disappeared, none of the Sixth Tribulation experts felt relaxed at all. On the contrary, compared to the nervousness caused by the power before, they were now completely terrified. This was not because they were despicable, but because it was not the power itself that made the power disappear. Instead, it was an even more terrifying existence. It was a kind of power that was boundless and dangerous to the extreme. If that kind of power from before had only made them feel a sense of danger, it was as if a single movement from them would attract a terrifying attack that could completely crush them. But now, this power that had suppressed that power to the point where it disappeared made them feel that even if they did not move, they would suffer a terrifying punishment that even death could not compare to. In the face of such power, how could they not be more fearful than before? Tao Master's prison. Those sixth tribulation powerhouses were not ignorant after all. They naturally knew what this extremely terrifying power was. This terrifying power was almost the same as the power that descended from the Tao Master's prison that they had at least heard of. However, it was many times more powerful than any of the Tao Master's prison that they had ever heard of. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in his own all heavens, frowned slightly. Why did it suddenly descend? Such a thought flashed across his mind. However, he soon thought of the answer to the question. The eighth tribulation experts were unregistered on the sixth floor of the Road of Tao Master. According to the rules of the Road of Tao Master, they should not have appeared here. Originally, they had restrained their abilities so that their existence could not be detected by the Tao Master's prison. This prevented them from triggering the restrictions of the Tao Master's prison and thus the power of the Tao Master's prison. But what was the situation now? The current situation was that they had completely let go of themselves in the fruit of Tao and exerted their full strength. Even the fruit of Tao could no longer suppress all their power, causing the power to leak out of the fruit of Tao. The sixth tribulation experts were like ants in the face of a divine dragon. If he could not be discovered by the Tao Master's prison, then the Tao Master's prison would be too useless. Therefore, it was perfectly normal for the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to descend at this moment. Of course, although it was such a normal descent, it was not the right time for Luo Fan to descend. Because at this moment, the battle between the eighth tribulation experts was an extremely good target for him to observe. By observing all kinds of mysterious means displayed by these eighth tribulation experts in the process of fighting, he was able to have a deeper understanding of the eighth tribulation experts' realms. This kind of understanding would obviously be of great help to his cultivation. At a time like this, the power of the Tao Master's purgatory had descended to deal with these eight tribulations experts. This was obviously to disrupt his chance to observe these eight tribulations experts. I can't let them be taken away. This thought surfaced in Luo Fan's mind. With a thought, Luo Fan's incarnation within the fruit of Tao reacted. In an instant, time flowed backwards and everything within the fruit of Tao was reversed, returning to the time before the eighth tribulation experts truly showed their power. During this process, the eighth tribulation experts themselves were almost unaffected. They were still clearly aware of everything that had happened before time flowed backwards, and they had witnessed the entire process. However, they were the only ones who could clearly understand all of this. Apart from them, even the sixth tribulation experts did not know that time had flowed backward. At least, they did not know this yet. Perhaps they would discover this when they re-established contact with their original bodies, but that would be a matter for the future. At this moment, in their perception, the flow of time was very normal. They had completely forgotten the entire process of the eighth tribulation powerhouse's performance. It was as if nothing had happened. Even if they were so furious at the eighth tribulation expert that they wanted to perish together with him, time flowed backwards. What happened? The eighth tribulation experts' hearts skipped a beat. Compared to changing the past, going back in time was actually not that special. In fact, to be more precise, changing the past was even more brilliant and difficult. The Tao fruit of division could change the past, so reversing the flow of time was obviously not a difficult task for it. Thus, they weren't surprised at all that the fruit of the way was able to turn back time. However, although they were not surprised by the appearance of this ability, they found it a little difficult to understand why Luo Fan chose to reverse time at this moment. There did not seem to be anything that forced him to choose to reverse time just now. It could not be that what they did just now would develop to the point where the fruit of Tao would suffer irreversible damage in the future, forcing it to choose to reverse everything at this moment. However, this did not make sense. If that was really the case, wouldn't it be better to just silently change the past? Why did he have to do it so crudely and reveal everything in front of them? After thinking about it, it seemed like the only reason was that something they did not know had happened just now. Unfortunately, this reason meant that they could not gain anything no matter what. Because this reason was that they did not know under such circumstances, no matter how they thought about it, it was obvious that they could not figure it out. Soon, they decided not to think about it anymore. Given their hatred and displeasure towards each other, how could the battle that was stopped just now be the last one? Since it was interrupted, they might as well do it again. In short, they had to vent their grievances and anger first. At this moment, Luo Fan had no intention of stopping them, because at this moment, he had already discovered that his actions and the methods he used had no effect on the power of the Tao Master's prison. At this moment, the power of the Tao Master's prison did not dissipate because it had lost its source. Instead, it continued to gather and seep into his fruit of Tao. This obviously meant that his previous efforts to reverse time had no effect on the power of the Tao Master's prison. The power of the Tao Master's prison did not lose the 8th tribulation experts. Since it had proven that his efforts had no effect, there was naturally no need for such a futile attempt. At this moment, the 8th tribulation experts attacked at the same time. Boundless power that was so high that even those who had transcended could not imagine instantly surged from various parts of the endless world. It seeped into the cause and effect, destiny, dimensions, future, and so on of the endless world, and began a battle that was beyond the comprehension of countless people who had transcended. Whether it was the beginning, the process, or the final outcome of these battles, they could not understand them. However, no matter how slow they were, they could still clearly sense the commotion caused by it. That's because everything in this world was violently trembling at this moment, as if it was in the final stages of collapse. Everything seemed to be reaching the end. How could those transcendent beings not sense such a situation? Unfortunately, at this moment, even if they felt this, they could only express their anger through words. There was no other way to reverse this situation. That was because all of their methods were so weak and dangerous compared to these changes. They were weak because their methods could not shake the methods of the 8th tribulation expert. No matter how hard they tried, they could not shake the various fluctuations caused by the 8th tribulation experts. However, from another point of view, their current methods might be the last straw for the endless world that seemed to be reaching the end and was about to completely collapse in the next moment. Perhaps if they used a little bit of their power, they could cause the endless world to be completely destroyed. Under such circumstances, their methods were naturally extremely dangerous. This was precisely why they did not dare to make a move. They were weak and dangerous. If they made a move, they would be asking for trouble. They would be trying to kill themselves. This was something that these people who had transcended were not willing to do, even when they were in extreme danger. At this moment, Luo Fan seized the time to investigate all the methods that these 8th tribulation experts had used. After all, he clearly knew that very soon, they would face the power of the Tao Master's prison. Once the power of the Tao Master's prison attacked, what awaited them would be them being directly taken away. There was no other possibility. As a result, this period of time might be the last time that Luo Fan would see these 8th tribulation experts. How could he not cherish this last chance? How could he not grasp it? Of course, even so, he did not forget to alleviate the effects of the 8th tribulation experts' methods on the endless world. After all, although he could reverse time, all of this was based on the existence of the division Dao fruit. If the division Dao fruit disappeared, his power to reverse time would naturally become water without a source, a tree without roots. At least, it would not reach the level when the division Dao fruit still existed. Obviously, according to the methods that these 8th tribulation experts had displayed, if they were allowed to use their full power, the division Dao fruit might really be completely destroyed in a very short period of time. Therefore, it was obvious that he would not allow these powers to wantonly destroy the division Dao fruit in the endless world. He had to eliminate the effects of these methods on the division Dao fruit at all times, to prevent the division Dao fruit from completely collapsing under their destruction. As for the methods that Luo Fan used, there was no need to mention them. The division Dao fruit could not only reverse time, its most powerful method was to change the past. Under the circumstances that it could change the past, time was just a weapon that could be used at will. Countless methods that should have taken an endless amount of time to take form were all executed with a single thought from him. And with the help of time, to what extent could Luo Fan achieve? Don't forget that a connate zenith heaven could actually be said to be omnipotent. However, a large part of the omnipotence at that time required the accumulation of endless time and energy to achieve it. Even a connate zenith heaven was like this, and it was even more so for the higher realms. When one's level reached Luo Fan's current level, which was a peak 7th tribulation expert, the omnipotent level would naturally be even higher. The level of omnipotence was actually reflected in the amount of time needed to achieve what one wanted to achieve. For example, for connate zenith heaven, it was indeed possible to split open heaven and earth. However, according to the ability of a golden immortal realm cultivator, if one wanted to truly establish a world, then perhaps it would require a trillion years of time, and it was even to the extent that one would have to pour all the energy they recovered during these trillion years into it in order to accomplish it. For a 7th tribulation powerhouse like Luo Fan, he didn't even need to be a 7th tribulation powerhouse. He only needed a tribulation powerhouse, and the time he needed would be 10 million years, a million years, or even shorter. This was only limited to cultivators who walked the right path. If it was Luo Fan who walked the wrong path, he would be able to do it with just a thought. Clearly, these two situations could be considered as splitting open heaven and earth, but there was a huge difference between their levels. It was the same for omnipotence. Connate zenith heaven was also said to be omnipotent, and people at Luo Fan's level were also said to be omnipotent. The higher realms were also said to be omnipotent. However, there was a huge difference in the levels of these omnipotences. Of course, if one really wanted to define omnipotence with the omnipotence of a true saint, none of these existences below the true saint level could be said to be omnipotent. Of course, it was not meaningless to talk about omnipotence at this time. Talking about the level of omnipotence at this time was to show how many things Luo Fan could achieve with the help of time. Chapter 32:27. What he could do, if he used it on the 8 tribulation experts at this time, the effect would obviously be considerable. In the eyes of the 8 tribulation experts, no matter what means they used to attack each other, no matter what kind of incredible power leaked out, for the surrounding endless heaven and earth, it could only shake the endless heaven and earth. There was no real harm done to it at all. Even if the endless heaven and earth looked so dangerous at this time, as if it could fall into some kind of incredible destruction in the next moment, it was just on the surface. Only those who could not see clearly would feel that the endless heaven and earth was about to be destroyed. Every one of the 8 tribulation experts knew clearly that the endless heaven and earth was still as stable as Mount Tai. It was still far from being destroyed. In the face of such a situation, the 8 tribulation experts naturally had no scruples in fighting. For the 8 tribulation experts, it was impossible for them to have any feelings for the endless heaven and earth. For them, the endless heaven and earth and the division of Tao fruit were just something that they had accidentally found in the sixth layer of the Tao Master's road. It was just a pleasant surprise for them to explore. What did such a place have to do with them? Even if it was destroyed, their feelings would not be hurt at all. In this way, it was impossible for them to worry about the endless heaven and earth being destroyed because of feelings. The reason why they were worried about the endless heaven and earth being destroyed was actually very simple. It was because the endless heaven and earth was quite valuable in their eyes. Just like a person, he would naturally not have any feelings for other people's things. No one would be emotionally affected by the destruction of other people's things. However, if that thing could help him learn something or let him know something he wanted to know, then he would obviously feel it was a pity that it was destroyed. At this time, for the 8 tribulation experts, the division of Tao fruit and the endless heaven and earth were things that were useful to them and could benefit them. For such a thing, it was impossible for them not to feel any pity for it to be destroyed. Therefore, although it seemed that they were desperate and did not care about the endless heaven and earth at all, in fact, they still had a bottom line. That was, not to completely destroy the endless heaven and earth. Even if it was the most thorough destruction, they had to preserve the existence of the endless heaven and earth. Of course, they didn't care much about injuries. That was why he had behaved in such a manner before. That was also why the numerous transcendents in the endless world felt the danger of being on the verge of destruction. But at this moment, because of the unbelievable means that Luo Fan displayed to eliminate the aftermath, they completely let go of their worries for the safety of the endless world. In other words, they understood that even if they unleashed all their abilities, it was impossible for them to truly destroy this boundless world. With this understanding, they naturally no longer had any misgivings and began to display their strength without restraint. At this moment, the attention of the 7/8 tribulation experts was already focused on each other. Naturally, there was a difference in strength between them. Although it was not too big, they were different cultivators after all. After all, they had cultivated for different paths. After all, the number of years they had cultivated was also different. Naturally, there would be a big or small difference in strength. The existence of such a gap meant that if they were to fight without holding back, there would definitely be a victor in the end. In other words, some of the stronger ones would emerge victorious, while the weaker ones would ultimately lose. However, it was clear that the current situation was different from normal. Right now, the 7/8 tribulation experts were irreconcilable enemies. Even if they were a little more rational due to the endless heaven and earth and could slightly limit their power, the hatred between them did not ease at all. Under such circumstances, they would naturally view every other 8th tribulation expert with hostility. And this sort of hostility would naturally cause them to destroy any other 8th tribulation expert's success. Even if they succeeded in completely defeating one of their enemies, this kind of success would still be the same. In other words, even if the weaker 8th tribulation experts encountered a critical juncture where they were about to fail, they would definitely not completely fail. The other 8th tribulation experts would definitely stop the 8th tribulation expert who was about to completely defeat them, allowing them to catch their breath and escape safely. This would allow the overall situation to return to its original state of balance. In this way, it could be said that their battle would not truly end before both of them were completely exhausted. And according to the relationship between them, their final outcome was very likely to be both failure and victory at the same time. In other words, the relationship between them had not changed at all from before the battle. This could already be considered as both of them achieving nothing. Of course, this was only the outcome if the current situation continued to develop. After all, these 8th tribulation experts were not robots. They would also change. When they realized that the outcome would inevitably lead to everyone achieving nothing, they would naturally start to think of ways to change this outcome. And once they started to think of ways to change the outcome, the final outcome would almost certainly be changed. After all, these were 8th tribulation experts who were much stronger than 7th tribulation experts. This kind of existence was extremely intelligent and powerful. It was not something that ordinary cultivators could imagine. At their level, what inconceivable things couldn't be done? Even if it seemed to be a deadlock, as long as they had enough time and energy, they would definitely be able to think of a solution. Even now, Luo Fan still couldn't think of a solution. Unfortunately, the reality was that they did not have that much time or energy to invest in it. At this moment, the power of the Tao Master's prison had truly seeped into the split Tao fruit and completely locked onto the 7 of them. In this instant, the 7 8th tribulation experts suddenly felt their bodies freeze, and an indescribable terror suddenly enveloped their hearts. It was a terror that their lives would completely not belong to them in the next moment. Under such circumstances, how could they continue to pay attention to each other like before? In the face of such a situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He seemed to be somewhat regretful as he sighed, "What a pity, your time is up." As he said this, the power of the Tao Master's prison covered the sky and the earth, completely sealing off all escape routes for the 7 8th tribulation experts. The 7 8th tribulation experts were all sealed in an indescribable space-time created by the power of the Tao Master's prison. This space-time was like a vast world, completely separating them from everything in the outside world. At this moment, even their bodies had lost their sense of them. It could be said that in this aspect, this space-time was actually not the slightest bit inferior to the vast world. After this, in the face of such a change, the expressions of the 8th tribulation experts turned extremely ugly. Tao Master's prison. Why did the power of the Tao Master's prison appear? They felt that their views of the world had been overturned. The 8th tribulation expert who attacked at the beginning was clearly fine when he attacked with all his strength. Why did things happen to them when they attacked? They had all used their trump cards and unleashed the same level of power, so why was there such a huge difference? Among them, the 8th tribulation expert who attacked at the beginning was the most difficult to understand. He also could not understand why his unleashing of all his strength would attract the power of the Tao Master's prison. It was clearly fine for him to attack at the beginning, so why did such a huge problem occur and attract the power of the Tao Master's prison? It's the capacity. However, an 8th tribulation expert was after all an 8th tribulation expert. Even if it was something that they had no clue about, as long as they seriously thought about it, they would be able to think of a possible reason. The difference between the situation later and the situation at the beginning was the difference in the number of 8th tribulation experts that attacked. And the difference in the number and the cause of the difference was obviously related to the capacity of the endless world. At the beginning, his attack did not attract the power of the Tao Master's prison because the power did not exceed the capacity of the endless world. It was still contained by the endless world and did not leak out. And since it did not leak out, it naturally did not trigger the rules of the Tao Master's prison, and naturally did not attract the power of the Tao Master's prison. Later on, the number of 8th tribulation experts that attacked had increased to 7. The impact of the power had clearly exceeded the capacity of the endless world. There was already a large amount of power that the endless world could not contain. In this way, the power that could not be contained would naturally leak out, and would naturally trigger the rules of the Tao Master's path and the Tao Master's prison, which would then attract the power of the Tao Master's prison. As for why the power of the Tao Master's prison could break into the endless world and enter the Tao fruit splitting, it was even simpler. It was the Tao Master's prison. It was a punishment mechanism that the Tao Master's path had set up to restrict all cultivators. Such an existence naturally far surpassed all cultivators and all living beings on the Tao Master's path. Although the Tao fruit splitting was brilliant, and even a 9th tribulation expert would be interested in it, It was ultimately something that was formed by a cultivator on the Tao Master's path. How could such an existence surpass the power of the Tao Master's prison? As long as the Tao Master's prison wanted to invade, it would naturally be able to do so. There was no other possibility. In the face of such a situation, the eyes of the Eighth Tribulation experts were filled with indescribable regret. If they had thought of this earlier, would they still have acted so recklessly? If that was the case, they would definitely have thought of some way to test the capacity of the endless world before making a move. The power of the Tao Master's prison was absolute for cultivators, even for Eighth Tribulation experts. They had already been enveloped by the power of the Tao Master's prison, completely sealing off all escape routes. Even their connection with their main bodies had been completely cut off. In the face of such a situation, it could be said that they no longer had any chance to turn things around. At this moment, their hearts were filled with despair. Of course, even so, they could not just sit and wait for their death. Even though they knew that they had completely failed, and that there was a high chance that they would fall into despair, they did not give up on fighting and resisting. At this moment, the power in the bodies of the Eighth Tribulation experts began to brew, and terrifying power began to compress within their bodies. As the power was being compressed, an increasingly powerful aura was released from their bodies, and it began to clash with the power of the Tao Master's prison. This conflict gave rise to all sorts of strange phenomena. For example, the rumbling was only the most basic, simplest, and most violent phenomenon. Compared to this violent phenomenon, there were many other mysterious phenomena that were difficult to describe with words. Even ordinary living beings and cultivators would not be able to understand them. Amidst these phenomena, the Eighth Tribulation experts seemed to have turned into an endless world. The past, present, and future were constantly changing at this moment, and even their incomplete worldview was vividly displayed at this moment. Under such circumstances, the spacetime formed by the power of the Tao Master's prison could not hold on any longer, and began to emit cracking sounds, as though it was about to split apart. However, it was clear that the power of the Tao Master's prison was not without a source. It was also supported by an incomparably huge Tao Master's prison. At this moment, the endless power of the Tao Master's prison began to traverse through space, and appeared around the spacetime. It constantly gathered towards the spacetime, and rapidly repaired the damage suffered by the spacetime. No matter how many times the spacetime cracked, or how big the crack was, it would completely recover in the next instant. Moreover, every time the spacetime recovered, it would become more stable, and the isolation effect would become stronger. After a few times, the spacetime had already completely isolated all external gazes, causing the connection between the inside and the outside to be completely severed, both tangible and intangible. At this moment, the spacetime could no longer be seen as a spacetime. At a glance, it looked like a ball of chaos.